There are places in this world that feel wrong the moment you step into them. Places where the air is quiet in a way that makes your skin. Remember, fear before your mind understands why. And somewhere beyond a forgotten border, something is waiting. This is Annihilation, the haunting creation of Jeff VanderMeer. A story born from long walks through the wild landscapes of Florida, where dense marshes, strange silences, and untamed nature slowly transformed into something far more unsettling inside his imagination. In 2014, that vision emerged into the world and quietly spread across continents, reaching millions of readers who stepped into Area X and never quite left unchanged. VanderMeer had already become known for bending the boundaries of strange fiction through works like Born and his award-winning storytelling. But Annihilation became something different, a doorway into a dream that felt beautiful and deeply wrong. It would later inspire the 2018 film Adaptation directed by Alex Garland, carrying its mystery onto the screen in a form that felt like a memory of the book rather than an echo of it. As you travel deeper tonight, know this isn't a word-for-word reading. This is a third-person retelling, a journey through the story's shadows and secrets. And the visuals in this video are created using today's technology. They may not always perfectly match every scene from the story, but they are designed to help you visualize the world and atmosphere as you listen. Stay close, because along the way you'll uncover strange facts, adaptation secrets, and behind-the-scenes details hidden beneath the surface. You're already standing at the edge now, and beyond it nothing follows familiar rules. The story begins. The structure stood where it had no right to be. A circular slab of gray stone, 60 feet across, rising just 8 inches above the forest floor. It lay at the precise threshold where the black pines surrendered to swamp, and the swamp would soon give way to salt marsh, reeds, and wind-bent trees. Beyond that, the ocean waited, and farther down the coast, a derelict lighthouse. This entire region had been abandoned for decades, for reasons that defied easy explanation. The expedition, the first to enter Area X in over 2 years, consisted of 4 women, a biologist, an anthropologist, a surveyor, and a psychologist. The narrator, the biologist, noted how the older psychologist had been appointed leader, and how all of them had been placed under hypnosis to cross the border, a measure meant to keep them calm. They had hiked for 4 hard days after crossing to reach the coast. Their mission sounded straightforward enough. Continue the government's investigation into Area X's mysteries, working outward from base camp. The expedition could last days, months, or even years. They carried 6 months of supplies, with another 2 years' worth already cached at camp, and had been assured it was safe to forage if necessary. Their most peculiar piece of equipment was a small black rectangle on their belts, a measuring device they'd been told nothing about. If its glass-covered hole glowed red, they would have 30 minutes to reach safety. They had no watches, no compasses. After the first few hours, the biologist had stopped checking hers entirely. Upon reaching camp, they set to work replacing obsolete or damaged gear and erecting their own tents. They would rebuild the sheds later, once they were certain Area X had not affected them. The previous expedition's members had eventually drifted away one by one, returning to their families across the border by unknown means, unable to explain how they'd made the journey. This strange transference had occurred over 18 months, something no earlier expedition had experienced. But other, more violent phenomena could also cause what their superiors called premature dissolution, so they had to test their stamina in this place. They needed to acclimate to their surroundings. Black bears and coyotes roamed the forest near camp. Night herons startled from branches, and venomous snakes, at least 6 varieties, lay hidden in the undergrowth. Bogs and streams held huge aquatic reptiles, so they took care not to wade too deep when collecting water samples. Yet these familiar dangers didn't trouble them. What unsettled them were the remnants of human habitation. Rotting cabins with sunken, rust-colored roofs, wagon wheel spokes half buried, the faint outlines of old livestock enclosures buried under pine needle loam. Far worse was the low, powerful moaning at dusk. The wind and the strange interior stillness played tricks on their sense of direction, making the sound seem to seep into the black water that soaked the cypress trees. That water sat like glass, so dark it reflected their own faces back at them, along with the gray beards of moss that smothered the trunks. Looking out through these areas toward the ocean, they saw only black water, gray cypress, and the motionless rain of moss. All they heard was that low moaning. The effect couldn't be understood without experiencing it. Neither could the beauty of it, and seeing beauty in such desolation changed something inside a person. Desolation tried to colonize you. On their 4th day at camp, they found the tower. It wasn't on any map, not theirs, not the water-stained documents left by their predecessors. But there it was, half hidden by fallen moss off the trail, a circular block of grayish stone, like a mix of cement and crushed seashells. A rectangular opening at due north revealed stairs spiraling down into darkness, obscured by banana spiderwebs and storm debris, though a cool draft rose from below. Only the biologist thought of it as a tower. She couldn't explain why. It tunneled into the ground, could as easily have been a bunker or submerged building, but the word came to her unbidden. As soon as she saw the staircase, she had a sudden, vivid vision. The last expedition drifting away one by one, and later the ground shifting, leaving the lighthouse standing while depositing this underground part of it inland. She recognized, looking back, this as her first irrational thought since arriving. The surveyor insisted it was impossible staring at her maps, but the biologist pointed out that it was there, unless they were all hallucinating. The anthropologist observed that the architectural model was hard to identify. The materials were ambiguous, suggesting local origin, but not necessarily local construction. They wouldn't know if it was primitive or modern or something in between, without going inside. She wasn't sure she'd want to guess at its age either. They had no way to inform their superiors. Expeditions were forbidden outside contact, for fear of contamination. They'd brought almost nothing from the present era, no cell phones, computers, or complex instruments except those strange black boxes. Their cameras required a makeshift darkroom. The absence of cell phones made the real world feel very distant to the others, but the biologist had always preferred living without them. They had knives, a locked container of antique handguns, and one assault rifle, a reluctant concession to security standards. They were expected to keep records in lightweight, nearly indestructible journals with waterproof paper. These would either return with them or be recovered by the next expedition. They'd been cautioned to provide maximum context and ordered not to share entries with one another. Shared information could skew observations, their superiors believed, but the biologist knew from experience how hopeless this pursuit was. Nothing alive was truly objective. The psychologist interrupted before they could discuss the tower further, asking if they were excited. It was an odd question. She'd never asked that before. During training, she'd tended to ask about calmness in emergencies. The biologist had always felt the psychologist was playing a role, a bad actor, and now it seemed even more apparent, as if leading them made her nervous. The biologist replied that it was exciting and unexpected, though she couldn't quite keep a mocking edge from her voice. She was surprised to feel growing unease. Before crossing the border, she'd imagined far stranger things. Vast cities, peculiar animals, even a monster rising from the waves. This discovery should have seemed banal in comparison. The surveyor just shrugged, refusing to answer. The anthropologist nodded as if in agreement. The tower's entrance exerted a presence, a blank surface they could project anything onto, a low-grade fever pressing down on all of them. The biologist thought about how only the surveyor would last more than a day or two, though she didn't say that. She'd tell the others names if it mattered, but they were discouraged from using names. Names belonged to where they'd come from, not to who they were in Area X. The expedition had originally included a linguist, 5 of them. To reach the border, each had entered a separate bright white room with a single metal chair in the corner, the chair featuring holes for straps. The implications raised a prickle of alarm, but the biologist had been determined to reach Area X. The facility belonged to the Southern Reach, the clandestine government agency handling all matters related to Area X. They'd waded through innumerable readings and blasts of air from ceiling vents. The psychologist had visited each of them at some point, though the biologist couldn't remember what was said. Then they'd exited into a central staging area where the psychologist greeted them, but the linguist never reappeared. The psychologist explained she'd had second thoughts and decided to stay behind. There was relief that it hadn't been someone else. At the time, the linguist seemed most expendable. The psychologist told them to clear their minds, beginning the hypnosis process for crossing the border. She would put herself under a kind of self-hypnosis. They'd been told the border required precautions against their minds tricking them. Hallucinations were apparently common. At least, that was what they were told. The biologist could no longer be sure it was the truth. The border's actual nature had been withheld for security reasons. All they knew was that it was invisible. When she woke up with the others, they were already in full gear. Heavy hiking boots, 40-pound packs, supplies hanging from their belts. All three of them lurched, the anthropologist falling to one knee, while the psychologist waited patiently for them to recover, apologizing that this was the least startling re-entry she could manage. The surveyor's temper flared. She cursed under her breath and shot the psychologist a glare that suggested her volatility had likely been seen as an asset by their superiors. The anthropologist, by contrast, rose without complaint, steadying herself. The biologist, true to her nature, observed it all with clinical detachment, noting the faint, almost cruel smile that flickered across the psychologist's lips as she watched them struggle. Later, she would wonder if she'd misread that expression entirely. Perhaps it had been pain or self-pity instead. They found themselves on a dirt trail scattered with pebbles, dead leaves, and damp pine needles. Velvet ants and tiny emerald beetles crawled across the ground. Tall pines rose on both sides, their scaly bark catching the light, while bird shadows traced lines between them in the sky. The air struck them with such freshness that they strained to breathe for a few seconds, not from exertion but surprise. After marking their location with a red cloth tied to a tree, they began walking into the unknown. They'd been instructed that if the psychologist became incapacitated and couldn't lead them back across the border, they should return to await extraction. No one had explained what form that extraction might take, though the implication was that their superiors could observe the extraction point from afar, even from within the border. They were told not to look back upon arrival, but the biologist stole a glance while the psychologist's attention drifted elsewhere. What she saw was indistinct, already distant, a hazy block of fizzing light, like a gate or a trick of the eye, fast fading from view. Her reasons for volunteering were separate from her qualifications. She specialized in transitional environments, and this location offered a rare complexity. Within 6 or 7 miles, one moved from forest to swamp to salt marsh to beach. She'd been told Area X held marine life adapted to brackish water, creatures that swam up natural canals at low tide, sharing habitat with otters and deer. The beach, riddled with fiddler crab holes, occasionally revealed giant reptiles that had adapted as well. She understood why Area X was uninhabited, why it remained pristine, but she kept unremembering that fact. Instead, she pretended it was simply a protected wildlife refuge, and they were hikers who happened to be scientists. This self-deception served a purpose. They didn't know what had happened here, what was still happening, and performed theories would taint her analysis. Besides, her existence back in the world had become as empty as Area X itself. With nothing left to anchor her, she needed to be here. She didn't know what the others told themselves, didn't want to know, but she believed they all at least pretended to curiosity. Curiosity could be a powerful distraction. That night, they discussed the structure, though the other 3 insisted on calling it a tunnel. The responsibility for their investigations rested with each individual, the psychologist's authority forming a wider circle around those decisions. The rationale for sending expeditions now included giving each member autonomy to decide, which increased the possibility of significant variation. This vague protocol existed alongside their separate skill sets. All had basic weapons and survival training, but the surveyor had far more medical and firearms experience. The anthropologist had once been an architect and had survived a fire in a building she'd designed, the only personal detail the biologist had learned about her. The psychologist remained the most opaque, though they all assumed she came from a management background. The discussion about the structure became their first test of disagreement and compromise. The anthropologist argued they should explore farther first, returning to it later with more data, including from the lighthouse. The biologist found this predictable, perhaps even prescient, the anthropologist substituting a safer option. Though mapping seemed perfunctory to her, she couldn't deny the structure's existence, with no record of it on any map. The surveyor disagreed, feeling they should rule out the tunnel as invasive or threatening before pressing forward. It was like an enemy at their backs otherwise. Her military background gave weight to her opinion. The biologist had assumed a surveyor would always favor further exploration. The biologist admitted she was impatient to explore the habitats, but the structure's absence from maps made it important. Either a deliberate exclusion, which was a message of sorts, or something entirely new since the last expedition. The surveyor gave her a look of thanks, but her support wasn't about helping. The idea of a tower plunging downward played with a twin sensation of vertigo and fascination. Images of nautilus shells and natural patterns balanced against the thought of leaping off a cliff. The psychologist nodded, considering their opinions, then asked if anyone felt any inkling of wanting to leave. The question was legitimate but jarring. All three shook their heads. When the surveyor pressed for her opinion, the psychologist grinned, oddly, perhaps amused that a surveyor, an expert in surfaces, had been chosen to observe her reactions. She admitted to great unease, but couldn't tell if it stemmed from the environment or the tunnel's presence. Personally, she would like to rule out the tunnel. 3-1, the anthropologist said, relieved the decision had been made for her. The surveyor just shrugged. Perhaps the biologist had been wrong about curiosity. The surveyor didn't seem curious about anything. When she asked if the surveyor was bored, she replied she was eager to get on with it, addressing the group as if the question had been for all of them. The talk took place in the communal tent. As darkness fell, the strange mournful call came from the night, natural they knew, yet still raising a shiver. It seemed a signal to disband, and they retreated to their own quarters. The biologist lay awake, trying to turn the tower into a tunnel or shaft in her mind, but couldn't. Instead, one question kept returning. What lay hidden at its base? The hike from the border had been almost uneventful. Birds sang as they should. Deer fled, their white tails flashing through the underbrush. Raccoons swayed about their business, ignoring them. They felt almost giddy, free after months of training. In that transitional corridor, nothing could touch them. They were neither what they'd been nor what they would become. The day before reaching camp, that mood shattered briefly. An enormous wild boar appeared far ahead on the trail, barely identifiable even through binoculars. Despite poor eyesight, wild pigs have prodigious smell, and it began charging from 100 yards away. They had time to think, to draw long knives, the surveyor unslinging her assault rifle, though bullets might not stop a 700-pound pig. They didn't feel confident turning their attention from the boar to retrieve the locked handguns. The psychologist had no time to prepare a hypnotic suggestion. She could only shout warnings to keep distance and avoid contact. The anthropologist giggled nervously at the absurdity of an emergency taking so long to develop. Only the surveyor dropped to one knee for a better shot, following orders to kill only under threat. Through the binoculars, the biologist watched the boar's face grow stranger, contorted, as if in extreme inner torment. Nothing about its features looked extraordinary, yet she had the startling impression of some presence in the way its gaze turned inward, its head pulled left as by an invisible bridle. Electricity seemed to spark in its eyes, though she couldn't credit it as real, blaming her shaky hands. Whatever consumed the boar soon consumed its charge. It veered left with a great cry of anguish into the underbrush. By the time they reached the spot, it was gone, leaving only a thrashed trail. For hours, she turned inward toward rational explanations. Parasites, neurological hitchhikers. Then the boar faded into the backdrop, and she was staring into the future again. The morning after discovering the structure, they rose early, ate, and doused their fire. The air held a crisp seasonal chill. The surveyor broke open the weapons stash, giving each a handgun, keeping the assault rifle with its useful underbarrel flashlight. They hadn't expected to open that container so soon, and while no one protested, tension grew. They knew the second expedition had committed suicide by gunshot, the third had shot each other. Only after several casualty-free expeditions had firearms been reissued. They were the 12th expedition. They returned to the structure, all 4 of them. Sunlight dappled through moss and leaves, creating archipelagos of light on the flat entrance surface. It remained unremarkable, inert, not ominous, yet it took an act of will to stand there staring at the entry point. The biologist noticed the anthropologist checking her black box and felt relief to see no glowing red light. If there had been, they'd have had to abort. She didn't want that, despite her fear. The anthropologist wondered how deep it went. The psychologist reminded them to trust measurements. 61.4 feet in diameter, raised 7.9 inches, the stairwell near due north. Made of stone and coquina, not metal or bricks. That it wasn't on the maps meant only that a storm might have uncovered the entrance. The biologist found something almost endearing in the psychologist's faith in measurements and her rationalization for the structure's absence from maps. Perhaps she was trying to reassure herself as much as the group. Leading them, possibly knowing more than they did, must have been difficult and lonely. The surveyor made a dark joke about hoping it was only 6 feet deep so they could continue mapping, then went silent as they all caught the unintended echo of 6 feet under. The biologist confessed she couldn't stop thinking of it as a tower, not a tunnel. The distinction felt important before descent, even if it marked her as odd. The psychologist grudgingly allowed it if it made her more comfortable. They stood in silence under the canopy, watching a beetle spiral upward through dust motes, and the biologist felt they'd finally truly entered Area X. The surveyor offered to go first, and they were all relieved to defer. She had to back down the narrow, steep stairs, using sticks to clear spiderwebs, her assault rifle slung across her back. She teetered there, hair tied back, face tight and drawn, looking up at them with a strange smirk as if judging them before descending. The biologist found the empty space she left behind shocking, almost as if a face had floated up from the darkness instead. The psychologist called down, asking if everything was okay, and the surveyor grunted in response. They heard struggling on the short steps, then silence, then movement at a different rhythm that seemed like it might come from a second source. But the surveyor called up that it was clear to that level. Something thrilled in the biologist. Her vision of a tower wasn't disproven yet. The psychologist gave the perfunctory signal for the biologist and anthropologist to descend. An unidentified emotion surged through her, dark spots swimming in her vision, and she followed so eagerly through the remains of webs and insect husks into the cool brackishness that she nearly tripped the anthropologist. Her last view above was the psychologist frowning down, trees and blinding blue sky behind her against the stairwell's darkness. Below, shadows spread across off-white walls. The temperature dropped, sound muffled. About 20 feet down, the structure opened into a lower level with an 8-foot ceiling, 12 feet of stone above them. The surveyor's rifle flashlight illuminated the space. She faced away, examining the blank walls with a few cracks, likely from age or stress. The circumference matched the top, supporting the idea of a single solid structure buried in the earth. The surveyor pointed her rifle at a rounded archway in the far corner, darkness suggesting more steps downward. A tower, making this level a landing or turret. The biologist found herself mesmerized by the wall's blankness, trying to imagine the builder and failing. She thought of the lighthouse, how its familiar silhouette had reassured the others. The map showed it there. They recognized what it should look like. With the tower, they had none of that. No outline, no purpose, no context. The psychologist's measurements meant nothing without context. Clinging to them felt like madness. The anthropologist noted the regularity of the circle suggested precision in construction, already abandoning the idea of a tunnel. The biologist's thoughts spilled out in a rush. What was its purpose? Could it really not be on maps? Could prior expeditions have built and hidden it? Even without immediate threat, she felt compelled to fill the silence, as if the blank walls fed on it and something might manifest in the spaces between their words. A gasp from the surveyor cut her off. The surveyor trained her flashlight down into the archway, and they hurried over to see a stairway curving downward on broader steps. At shoulder height, clinging to the inner wall, the biologist saw what first looked like dimly sparkling green vines progressing into darkness. They resolved into words in cursive, letters raised about 6 inches off the wall. She pushed past them, blood roaring in her ears, compelled by the organic appearance of the discovery. The anthropologist warned her not to touch it, but she was too enthralled. If she'd had the impulse, she couldn't have stopped herself. She could understand the language, which both elated and frightened her. Suppressing 1,000 new questions, she read aloud from the beginning, a phrase about strangling fruit and seeds of the dead before the darkness swallowed the rest. The anthropologist echoed the words, in disbelief. The surveyor asked what they were made of, and the biologist realized she'd been so focused on meaning she hadn't considered physical composition. The question helped her fight the compulsion to keep reading, to descend deeper. She stepped closer, examining the letters. They were made from rich green fern-like moss, probably fungi or some other eukaryotic organism. The filaments packed close and rising from the wall, giving off a loamy smell with an undertone of rotting honey. The miniature forest swayed imperceptibly, and in the spaces between the green filaments, she saw translucent creatures shaped like tiny hands, golden nodules capping their fingers. Leaning in like a fool, she triggered a nodule in the W to burst, releasing a tiny spray of golden spores. She felt something enter her nose, smelled the rotting honey intensify. Unnerved, she stepped back, hiding her curses. She was already imagining the psychologist's reaction if her contamination was revealed. She told them it was some sort of fungi, the letters made from fruiting bodies, the closest answer she had. Her voice seemed calmer than her thoughts, and they didn't seem to have noticed the spores erupting. The surveyor asked if she was joking, and the anthropologist observed there was no recorded human language using this method of writing, asking if any animal communicated that way. The biologist laughed and said no. But her mind raced. The words were composed of symbiotic fruiting bodies from an unknown species, and the spores meant the air deeper down would be full of potential contaminants. She felt a calm settle over her, alongside a sensation of not being able to breathe. Psychological, not physiological, she told herself. She'd noticed no physical changes, but it didn't matter. They had no antidote for the unknown back at camp. The biologist weighed whether to warn the others about the spores, deciding against it, not necessarily selfishly, she told herself, but because alarming them served no purpose. Better to limit their direct exposure until they could return with proper equipment. She had inadequate data for any other evaluation anyway. She climbed back to the landing, where the surveyor and anthropologist watched expectantly, the anthropologist's gaze darting restlessly. The biologist could have fabricated something to stop that searching look, but what could she tell them except that the words were either impossible or insane, or both? An unknown language would have been easier to accept, paradoxically less mysterious than words they could read but couldn't understand. She suggested they go back up, not because it was the best course, but to limit their spore exposure until she could assess the long-term effects on herself. She also felt a growing compulsion to continue reading, and if she stayed much longer, they might have to physically restrain her. The other two didn't argue. But as they climbed, she experienced a moment of vertigo, the walls suddenly fleshy around her, as if they traveled inside a beast's gullet. Back above, she recounted what they'd seen, reciting some of the words. The psychologist froze in oddly attentive silence, then decided to descend and view them herself. The biologist struggled with whether to warn her, finally suggesting she only observe from the top of the stairs due to possible toxins, and that they should wear breathing masks next time. They'd inherited some from the last expedition in a sealed container. The psychologist responded with a pointed question about paralysis not being a cogent analysis, and the biologist felt a strange itchiness wash over her. She said nothing, did nothing. The others seemed not to notice the exchange. Only later did she realize the psychologist had tried to bind her with a hypnotic suggestion meant for her alone. Her reaction apparently passed inspection, and the psychologist descended while they waited anxiously above. The biologist felt a strange sense of ownership, agitated that the psychologist might experience the same compulsion to read further. She wanted the words to mean something, to remove doubt and bring reason back into her equations, thoughts that distracted her from contemplating the spore's effects on her system. The other two had no desire to talk, and after 15 minutes the psychologist awkwardly pushed back up into the light, blinking as her vision adjusted. She pronounced it interesting, the first time she'd seen anything like it, but seemed to cut herself off. The anthropologist exploded, pointing out that no one had ever seen anything like it in the entire history of the world, and the psychologist's flat response verged on the moronic. The surveyors stared at them both as if they were alien organisms. The psychologist asked if the anthropologist needed calming, her steely tone making the woman mumble something non-committal and stare at the ground. The biologist stepped into the silence, suggesting they needed time to think, to decide what to do next, meaning she needed time to see if the spores would affect her significantly enough to confess. The surveyor observed there might not be enough time in the world for that, having grasped the nightmare implications more fully than the others. But the psychologist sided with the biologist, agreeing they needed time and should spend the rest of the day doing what they were sent to do. They returned to camp for lunch, then focused on ordinary tasks while the biologist monitored her body for changes. She checked her temperature, an ache in her knee, even the black box, but it remained inert. Nothing radical had changed yet, as they took samples and readings near camp. As if straying too far would bring them under the tower's control, she gradually relaxed, telling herself the spores had no effect, though she knew incubation could take months or years. For the next few days at least, she thought she might be safe. The surveyor refined their maps. The anthropologist examined cabin remains a quarter-mile away. The psychologist stayed in her tent writing. The biologist spent an hour observing a tiny red and green tree frog, another hour tracking an iridescent black damselfly that shouldn't exist at sea level, and the rest of her time up a pine tree with binoculars focused on the coast and lighthouse. She liked climbing and found staring at the ocean calming. The air was so clean, while the world beyond the border was dirty, tired, winding down, at war with itself, and her work there had always felt like a futile attempt to save humanity from itself. Area X's biosphere teemed with bird life: warblers, flickers, cormorants, black ibis. The salt marshes yielded a minute-long glimpse of a pair of otters. At one point they glanced up, and she had the strange sensation they could see her watching. She often felt things weren't quite what they seemed in the wilderness, and had to fight that sensation to maintain objectivity. Something ponderous moved through the reeds closer to the lighthouse, in deep cover. She couldn't identify it, and eventually its disturbance ceased and she lost track entirely. Perhaps another wild pig, she imagined. By dusk, their busy-work strategy had calmed their nerves. Tension lifted. They joked at dinner. The anthropologist confessed she wished she knew what the biologist was thinking, and she replied that no, she didn't, which drew surprised laughter. She didn't want their voices in her head, their stories or problems. Why would they want hers? Still, camaraderie had begun to take hold, even if short-lived. The psychologist allowed each a couple of beers, loosening them up. The biologist even clumsily suggested they might stay in contact after the mission. She'd stopped checking herself for spore reactions by then, and found she got along with the surveyor better than expected. She still didn't like the anthropologist much, in the context of the mission. The woman had exhibited a lack of mental toughness in the field, though volunteering at all meant something. When the nightly marsh cry came after dark, they called back drunkenly in bravado. The beast seemed like an old friend compared to the tower. They were confident they'd eventually photograph it, document it, tag it, assign it a place in taxonomy. It would become known in a way the tower might not. But they stopped when the moans intensified with what seemed like anger, as if it knew they were mocking them. Nervous laughter passed around the fire, and the psychologist took that as her cue to ready them for the next day. Tomorrow they would go back to the tunnel, deeper, wearing breathing masks. They'd record the writing, determine its age, and how deep the tunnel descended. In the afternoons, they'd continue general investigations, repeating the schedule until they knew enough about the tunnel and its place in Area X. Her tone was matter-of-fact, rehearsed, as if discussing an abandoned shopping center. Then she abruptly stood and spoke the words, "Consolidation of authority." The surveyor and anthropologist went slack, eyes unfocused. The biologist, shocked, mimicked them, hoping the psychologist hadn't noticed her lag. She felt no compulsion, but clearly they'd been pre-programmed to enter a hypnotic state in response to those words. The psychologist's demeanor became more assertive. She instructed them that they would remember having discussed options and ultimately agreeing with her, feeling confident and calm about the decision. They would continue to see the structure as made of coquina and stone, trust their colleagues completely, and feel a continued sense of fellowship. Upon emerging, any bird in flight would trigger a strong feeling they were doing the right thing in the right place. When she snapped her fingers, they would have no memory of this conversation, but follow her directives, feeling tired and ready to retire without dreams or nightmares. The biologist stared straight ahead, took her cue from the others when the psychologist snapped her fingers, and retreated to her tent. Now she had new data to process along with the tower. She knew the psychologist's role included hypnotic suggestion. Couldn't blame her for performing it, but witnessing it laid out so nakedly troubled her. One thing to think you might be receiving suggestion, another to experience it as an observer. What level of control could she exert? What did she mean by saying they would continue to think of the tower as made of coquina and stone? Most importantly, the biologist now guessed at one effect of the spores. They had made her immune to the psychologist's hypnotic suggestions, making her a kind of conspirator against her. Even if the psychologist's purposes were benign, she felt a wave of anxiety at the thought of confessing her resistance, especially since it meant any underlying conditioning in their training was affecting her less and less. She now hid two secrets steadily, irrevocably becoming estranged from the expedition and its purpose. Estrangement was nothing new for these missions. The biologist understood this from the re-entry interviews she'd watched with the others. Videotapes of the 11th expedition's members, once identified and quarantined after their return. In most cases, family members had called authorities, finding their loved one's reappearance uncanny or frightening. Any papers found on them had been confiscated for study. This information, too, they'd been allowed to see. The interviews were brief. All 8 expedition members told the same story. No unusual phenomena, no unusual ratings, no internal conflicts. But each had eventually felt an intense desire to return home and had set out to do so. None could explain how they'd crossed back, or why they'd gone home instead of reporting to superiors. One by one, they'd simply abandoned the expedition, left their journals behind, and drifted home somehow. Throughout the interviews, their expressions were friendly, their gazes direct. Their words seemed flat, but that fit with the general calm, the dreamlike demeanor each had returned with. Even the compact, wiry military expert, who'd once been mercurial and energetic. In terms of affect, she couldn't tell any of the 8 apart. They seemed to see the world through a veil, speaking from across a vast distance. Their papers proved to be sketches of Area X landscapes, brief descriptions, cartoons of animals or caricatures of fellow members. All had drawn or written about the lighthouse at some point. Searching for hidden meaning was like searching for meaning in the natural world. If it existed, it could only be activated by the eye of the beholder. At the time, the biologist was seeking oblivion, and in those blank, anonymous faces, even the most painfully familiar, she sought a kind of benign escape, a death that wouldn't mean being dead. In the morning, she woke with heightened senses, the rough brown pine bark, the ordinary swoop of a woodpecker. Everything came as a minor revelation. The lingering fatigue from the 4-day hike had left her. Was this the spores or just a good night's sleep? She felt so refreshed she didn't care. But her reverie was soon tempered by disastrous news. The anthropologist was gone, her tent empty of personal effects. Worse, the psychologist seemed shaken, sleepless, squinting oddly, hair windblown, dirt caked on her boots. She favored her right side as if injured. The surveyor demanded to know where the anthropologist was, while the biologist hung back, trying to make sense of it. Her unspoken question, "What have you done with her?" felt unfair. Knowing the secret to the psychologist's magician's show didn't necessarily make her a threat. The psychologist explained that she'd talked to the anthropologist late last night. What she'd seen in that structure had unnerved her to the point of abandoning the expedition. She'd started back to the border to await extraction, taking a partial report so their superiors would know their progress. The psychologist's habit of a slim smile at inappropriate times made the biologist want to slap her. The surveyor pointed out the anthropologist had left her gear, her gun too. The psychologist said she'd taken only what she needed, leaving them more supplies, including an extra gun. The biologist asked if they really needed an extra gun, genuinely curious. In some ways, she found the psychologist as fascinating as the tower, her motivations, her reasons. Why not resort to hypnosis now? Perhaps some things weren't suggestible, or faded with repetition, or she lacked stamina after the night before. The psychologist said they didn't know what they needed, but they definitely didn't need the anthropologist if she couldn't do her job. The surveyor and biologist stared at her, the surveyor's arms crossed. They'd been trained to watch for signs of mental stress or dysfunction in colleagues. The surveyor was probably thinking what the biologist was thinking. They had a choice now. Accept the psychologist's explanation or reject it. Rejection meant saying she'd lied to them, rejecting her authority at a critical time. If they tried to follow the trail, hoping to catch up and verify her story, would they have the will to return to base camp afterward? The psychologist urged them to continue with the plan, to investigate the tower, and the word tower felt like a blatant plea for the biologist's loyalty. The surveyor still wavered, as if fighting the previous night's suggestion, which alarmed the biologist in another way. She was not going to leave Area X before investigating the tower. That fact was ingrained in every part of her. She couldn't bear to lose another team member so soon, leaving her alone with the psychologist, unsure of her and still unaware of the spore's effects. She sided with the psychologist, saying they should continue the mission and make do without the anthropologist. But her pointed stare at the surveyor made clear they would revisit the issue later. The surveyor gave a surly nod and looked away. An audible sigh of relief or exhaustion came from the psychologist. She said it was settled, brushed past the surveyor, and started making breakfast. The anthropologist had always made breakfast before. At the tower, the situation changed again. The surveyor and biologist had readied light packs, weapons, breathing masks. Too late for the biologist, but she wore hers anyway, and hard hats with fixed beams. But the psychologist stood on the grass just beyond the circle, slightly below them, and announced she'd stand guard. The biologist was incredulous. She didn't want the psychologist out of her sight, wanted her embedded in the risk, not standing at the top with power over them. The surveyor wasn't happy either, in a pleading way that suggested suppressed stress, arguing it was safer with 3. The psychologist insisted they needed the entrance secured, sliding a magazine into her handgun with a harsh scraping sound. The surveyor's grip on her assault rifle tightened, her knuckles whitening, as she insisted the psychologist come down with them. The psychologist responded with a hypnotic command, no reward in the risk of all of them going down. The surveyor's grip loosened, her features becoming indistinct for a moment, and she agreed, saying it made perfect sense. A twinge of fear traveled down the biologist's back. Now it was 2 against 1. She thought about it, taking in the full measure of the psychologist's stare. Nightmarish, paranoid scenarios came to her, returning to find the entrance blocked, or the psychologist picking them off as they reached the open sky. Except she could have killed them in their sleep any night. The biologist said it wasn't that important, that the psychologist was as valuable up here as down there. And so they descended under the psychologist's watchful eye. The first thing the biologist noticed on the staging level was that the tower was breathing. The walls, when she touched them, carried the echo of a heartbeat, and they were not stone but living tissue, with a silvery white phosphorescence rising from them. The world lurched. She sat down heavily, the surveyor beside her trying to help her up. She was shaking as she finally stood. The enormity of that moment, the tower was a living creature, they were descending into an organism, was almost beyond words. The surveyor asked what was wrong, voice muffled through her mask. The biologist grabbed her hand, forced her palm against the wall, ignoring her protests. She demanded to know if the surveyor could feel it, the vibration, the beat. The surveyor, scared and thinking the biologist was acting irrationally, couldn't feel anything. She kept pressing, asking about a vibration, a beat, then removed her hand and stepped back. The surveyor took a long breath, kept her palm against the wall, and finally admitted she felt nothing. Stone, of course. The wall was made of stone. In the arc of her helmet light, the surveyor's face looked hollowed out, eyes large and circled by darkness, the mask erasing her nose and mouth. The biologist took a deep breath, wanting it all to spill out. The contamination, the psychologist's hypnosis, the living tissue walls. But she didn't. She pulled herself together, as her husband used to say, because they had to go forward and the surveyor couldn't see what she saw. She couldn't make her see it. She dismissed it as disorientation, but the surveyor insisted they should go back up. She was panicking. The biologist made a weak joke about her black box not flashing, but the surveyor wasn't letting her off the hook. She'd seen something that wasn't there. The biologist admitted maybe she had, but argued that might be important. Part of the reporting, something she saw that the surveyor didn't, could be significant. The surveyor weighed that, asked how she felt now. She lied that she felt fine, that she didn't see anything now, even as her heart pounded like a trapped animal, and the surveyor was surrounded by a corona of white phosphorescence from the walls. Nothing was receding. The surveyor agreed to go on, but only if she promised to report anything unusual. The biologist almost laughed. Unusual? Like strange words on a wall among tiny unknown creatures? She promised, turning the tables by asking the surveyor to do the same. The surveyor warned her not to touch her again or she'd hurt her. The biologist nodded. The surveyor didn't like knowing she was physically stronger. Under that flawed agreement, they proceeded into the gullet of the tower, descending into an ongoing horror show of beauty and biodiversity so immense the biologist couldn't fully take it in. She tried, as she'd always tried from the beginning of her career. She thought of her lodestone, the overgrown swimming pool in the rented house where she grew up. Her mother was an overwrought, successful artist too fond of alcohol. Her father an underemployed accountant with get-rich-quick schemes that brought in nothing. Neither could focus on anything for long. Sometimes she felt as if she'd been placed with a family rather than born into one. They didn't clean the kidney-shaped pool. Grass grew long around it. Sedge weeds and towering plants took over. Bushes lunged up to obscure the chain-link fence. Moss grew in the tile cracks. Rain raised the water level, algae turning it brackish. Dragonflies scouted, bullfrogs moved in with their tadpoles, water gliders and beetles colonized it. She dumped her aquarium fish into the pool instead of getting rid of them. Some survived. Herons and egrets appeared, and small turtles somehow found their way there. Within months, it had become a functioning ecosystem. She would enter through the creaking gate, observe from a rusty lawn chair in the corner. Despite a strong fear of drowning, she'd always loved being near water. Inside the house, her parents did their banal, messy human things, some of it loudly, while she lost herself in the pool's micro-world. Her parents worried about her chronic introversion, lecturing her about friends, about making an effort, about earning money. But when she told them she'd had to hide from bullies at the bottom of gravel pits, they had no answers, nor when she punched a fellow student for no reason. So they proceeded, locked in separate imperatives. She pretended to be a biologist, and pretending often becomes a reasonable facsimile of what you mimic. She kept journals of her pool observations, knew each frog individually, old flopper, ugly leaper, and which species of heron turned up when. The beetles and dragonflies were harder, but she tried. She eschewed books, wanting to discover the information on her own first. As an only child, expert in solitude, she could have continued forever. She even jury-rigged a waterproof camera contraption, but time ran out. They couldn't afford the rent, moved to a tiny apartment stuffed with her mother's paintings. One of the great traumas of her life was worrying about the pool's fate. She never found out. She couldn't bear to go back. If funding ran out or a study area was developed, she never returned. Some deaths you shouldn't relive, some connections so deep that when broken you feel the snap inside you. Descending into the tower, she felt that flush of discovery again for the first time in a long time, but kept waiting for the snap. The steps kept revealing themselves, whitish like the spiraling teeth of some unfathomable beast. They kept descending because there seemed no choice. She wished for the surveyor's blinkered seeing. She knew now why the psychologist had sheltered them, wondered how she withstood it, with no one to shield her. At first, there were merely the words, and that was enough. They occurred always at roughly the same level on the left wall. She tried to record them, but there were too many, and their meaning came and went. Following them was following a trail of deception. She and the surveyor agreed to document the physicality, but it would require another mission to photograph the continuous, never-ending sentence. The unease of ignoring the word's ominous quality was palpable, infecting their own speech as they catalogued what they both saw. Either the psychologist wanted them to see the words, or suppressing the physical reality of the walls was a monumental, exhausting task. They experienced other things together. The air grew cooler, damper, with a gentle sweetness like muted nectar. They both saw the tiny hand-shaped creatures among the words. The ceilings were higher than expected. The surveyor could see glints and whirls like snail trails, tufts of moss or lichen, tiny long-limbed translucent creatures stilt walking there. But only the biologist saw the walls minutely rise and fall with the tower's breathing, the colors shifting in a rippling effect, and the ghosting of prior words in the same cursive script about 3 inches above and below the current words. These formed a watermark, pale hints of green or purple where raised letters had once been. Most repeated the main thread, but some didn't. While the surveyor took photographic samples, she read the phantom words, trying to find deviations. Several overlapping strands started and stopped. She lost track easily. The number of ghost scripts suggested the process had been ongoing for a long time, though without knowing each cycle's length, she couldn't estimate in years. There was another element she wasn't sure the surveyor could see. She tested her, pointing to an interlocking latticework covering the wall from below the phantom scripts to above them, the main strand in the middle. It vaguely resembled scorpions strung end to end. She didn't know if it was a language or just decorative. The surveyor could see it but didn't recognize it. The biologist felt a surge of irritation, not at her but at the wrong brain for the task. They needed a linguist. She could look at that latticework for ages and only see coral branching. The surveyor might see river tributaries. Eventually, she reconstructed fragments of variants. Questions about why rest when wickedness exists, about God's love for those who understand endurance and forgiveness, about being chosen for the service of a higher power. If the main thread formed a dark, incomprehensible sermon, the fragments shared that affinity without the heightened syntax. She wondered if the fragments came from longer accounts, perhaps from prior expedition members. For what purpose, and over how many years? But those questions would have to wait for the surface. Mechanically, like a golem, she took photographs of key phrases, even as the surveyor thought she was clicking blank wall or off-center shots of the fungal words, to put distance between herself and whatever she might think about the variants. The main scrawl continued to unnerve. A phrase about black water and sun shining at midnight, fruit ripening and splitting open to reveal fatal softness in the earth. Those words defeated her somehow. She took samples half-heartedly, stuffing tiny remnants into glass tubes with tweezers. What would they tell her? Not much, she felt. Sometimes you sense when microscopes won't reveal the truth. Soon the heartbeat through the walls became so loud she stopped to put in earplugs, choosing a moment when the surveyor's attention was elsewhere. Bemasked, half-deaf for different reasons, they continued descending. It should have been her who noticed the change, not the surveyor. But after an hour, the surveyor stopped on the steps below and asked if the words seemed fresher, more recent. The biologist stared at her, feeling her hard-won distance slipping away. She suggested they turn off their lights, and the surveyor hesitated. After her earlier impulsiveness, trust would take time. But she did it. The biologist had left her gun holstered. The surveyor could have extinguished her in a moment with the assault rifle. This premonition of violence made little rational sense, yet came too easily, almost as if planted by outside forces. In the dark, with the tower's heartbeat throbbing against her eardrums, the words swayed as the walls trembled with their breathing. They seemed more active, colors brighter, strobing more intense than above. The bright, wet slickness of the new. Standing there, she said it before the surveyor could, to own it. Something below was writing this script, might still be in the process of writing it. They were exploring an organism that might contain another organism, itself using yet other organisms to write words on the wall. It made the overgrown pool of her youth seem simplistic, one-dimensional. They turned their lights back on. The surveyor's eyes held fear but also determination. The biologist had no idea what she saw in her own. The surveyor asked why she'd said something rather than someone. Why couldn't it be someone? The biologist just shrugged. The surveyor told her to get out her gun, disgust masking deeper emotion. She complied, though holding the gun felt clumsy and wrong, the wrong reaction to whatever might confront them. They had switched roles. They stopped documenting, walked more swiftly, focused on interpreting the darkness ahead, spoke in whispers. She went first, the surveyor covering her from behind until the curves where she went first. They didn't speak of turning back. The psychologist might as well have been thousands of miles away. They were charged with nervous energy, knowing there might be an answer below them, a living, breathing answer. The surveyor couldn't feel or hear the walls beating, but as they progressed, even the biologist couldn't picture the writer, only a fuzzy white blankness, like what she'd seen when she'd stared back at the border. Still, she knew it couldn't be human. 20 minutes later, the surveyor noticed something on the floor. The steps had been covered in a residue for some time. The biologist hadn't stopped to examine it, unsure if the surveyor could see it. It covered the steps from the left wall to about 2 feet from the right, about 8 or 9 feet wide. She knelt, training her light on the upper steps. The residue sparkled with a subdued golden shimmer shot through with red flakes like dried blood, partially reflective. She probed it with a pen, slightly viscous, like slime, about half an inch deep. The impression was of something sliding down the stairs. The surveyor pointed out marks, oval shapes about 1 foot long by half a foot wide, 6 of them splayed in 2 rows, with indentations like cilia marks inside. About 10 inches outside the tracks, 2 lines formed an irregular double circle undulating out and in like a skirt hem. Beyond were faint indicators of further waves, like lines left in sand as surf recedes, blurred and fuzzy. The biologist was fascinated, imagining a creature that corrected for the stair's slant like a geostabilizing camera. She'd never seen anything like it. The surveyor pointed to a step farther up, a boot print, but not from either of them. A third set heading back up. Another person, down here not long ago. The surveyor started cursing. They didn't think to look for more sets of boot prints. According to the records, the first expedition reported nothing unusual. After the second and third didn't return, expeditions were shut down, then resumed with carefully chosen volunteers. The 11th expedition had been personally difficult. Her husband had been on the 11th as a medic. He'd always wanted first response or trauma work, a triage nurse in the field. A friend from his Navy days recruited him. At first he'd been unsure, but they convinced him. It caused strife between them, though they already had difficulties. She'd hoped to be seen as a credible, objective witness, not someone who volunteered because of him. In a sense, that was still true, but how could she not be affected by Area X, if only through him? One night, about a year after he'd left, she heard someone in the kitchen. Armed with a baseball bat, she turned on all the lights and found him next to the refrigerator, still in expedition clothes, drinking milk until it ran down his chin and neck, eating leftovers furiously. She was speechless, staring at him as if he were a mirage that would dissipate. They sat in the living room, him on the sofa, her in a chair opposite. He didn't remember how he'd left Area X or the journey home, had only vague recollections of the expedition. An odd calm about him, punctured by moments of remote panic when he recognized his amnesia was unnatural. Gone, too, seemed to be any memory of their marriage's disintegration before his leaving. He contained the distance he'd accused her of in the past. She couldn't take it. She took off his clothes, made him shower, led him to bed, and made love to him with her on top, trying to reclaim remnants of the man she remembered. Outgoing, impetuous, always wanting to be of use, a passionate sailor. She could find none of that. He looked up at her through a fog. It helped for a while, made him more real, allowed her to pretend. But only for a while. She had him back for about 24 hours. They came for him the next evening. After security clearance, she visited him in the observation facility right up to the end. He greeted her like an old friend, not a lover. She went hoping for some spark of the man she'd once known, but never found it. Even the day they told her he had an operable systemic cancer, he stared at her with a slightly puzzled expression. He died 6 months later. Throughout that time, she could never get past the mask, never find the man she'd known inside him, not through personal interactions, not through watching the interviews with him and the other expedition members, all of whom died of cancer as well. Whatever had happened in Area X, he hadn't come back. Not really. She asked herself, as they went ever farther into the darkness, if her husband had experienced any of this. She didn't know how her infection changed things. Was she on the same journey, or had he found something completely different? If similar, how had his reactions differed, and how had that changed what happened next? The slime path grew thicker. The red flecks were living organisms discharged by whatever lay below, wriggling in the viscous layer. The substance had intensified to a sparkling golden carpet leading to some strange, magnificent banquet. They kept asking each other if they should go back, and the other would say, just around the next corner, just a little farther. It was a test of fragile trust, of curiosity and fascination walking beside fear, of whether they preferred ignorance or danger. The stickiness mired them even as they kept moving. If they pushed too far, inertia would end them. The surveyor rounded a corner and recoiled into the biologist, shoving her back up the steps. She whispered that there was something down there, like a body or a person. The biologist asked if it was writing on the wall. The surveyor said it was slumped by the wall. She'd only glimpsed it. The biologist asked if it was a man or a woman. The surveyor just repeated that she thought it was a person, as if preparing for something worse. But they couldn't climb out without investigating this new mystery. The biologist grabbed her shoulders, insisted it was likely the person from the other boot print, not whatever they'd been tracking. They could take a look, then go back up. This was as far as they'd go, no matter what they found. The surveyor nodded, steadying at the thought of this being the extent of it. They started back down, the steps slippery, walking slowly, using the blank right wall for balance. The tower was silent, holding its breath, its heartbeat suddenly distant. Or perhaps she could only hear her own blood rushing. Turning the corner, she saw the figure and shone her light on it. It was the anthropologist, slumped against the left wall, hands in her lap, head down as if in prayer, something green spilling from her mouth. Her clothing seemed fuzzy, indistinct. A faint golden glow rose from her body, almost imperceptible. The biologist knew she was dead. Her thought was that the psychologist had lied to them, and the pressure of her presence far above, guarding the entrance, pressed down on her intolerably. She motioned for the surveyor to stay back, stepped forward, and confirmed the stairs below were empty, then hurried back. She told the surveyor to keep watch while she examined the body, not mentioning she'd sensed something moving slowly farther below. The surveyor asked if it was a body. The biologist told her it was the anthropologist, and saw that information register in the tensing of her shoulders. The surveyor brushed past to take up position beyond the body, rifle aimed into the darkness. The biologist knelt. The anthropologist's face was mostly gone, covered in odd burn marks. From her broken jaw, as if wrenched open in a single brutal act, green ash spilled onto her chest. Her hands had no skin, only gauzy filament and more burns. Her legs were fused and half melted, one boot missing, one against the wall. Sample tubes lay scattered around her. Her black box, crushed, lay several feet away. The surveyor whispered, asking what happened, quick nervous glances back, as if expecting the anthropologist to come back to horrifying life. The biologist didn't answer. She shone her light on the wall above the body. The script became erratic for several feet, leaping and dipping before regaining equilibrium. She said she thought the anthropologist had interrupted the creator of the script. The surveyor asked if that thing had done this to her, pleading for another explanation. The biologist had none. She began to think like a detective surveying the ground. The thing, she couldn't think of it as human, had turned in a frenzy, the slime forming a clockwise swirl, the feet marks elongated by the sudden change. On top of this swirl were boot prints. She retrieved the missing boot, walking around the evidence. The boot prints in the middle were the anthropologist's, and she could follow partial imprints back up the right wall, as if she'd been hugging it. An image formed, the anthropologist creeping down in the dark to observe the script's creator, the sample tubes suggesting she'd hoped to take one. How insane or oblivious, the anthropologist had never struck her as impulsive or brave. She backtracked farther up and motioned for the surveyor to hold position. Another dozen steps up, she found two sets of boot prints facing each other, one the anthropologist's, the other neither hers nor the surveyor's. Something clicked. In the middle of the night, the psychologist had woken the anthropologist, put her under hypnosis, and together they'd come this far. The psychologist had given the anthropologist a suicidal order, and she'd walked right up to the thing and tried to take a sample, dying in agony. The psychologist had then fled. The biologist could find no trace of her boot prints below that point. She felt pity or empathy for the anthropologist. Weak, trapped, with no choice. The surveyor asked what she'd found. She told her another person had been there with the anthropologist and shared her theory. The surveyor couldn't understand why the psychologist would do that. They were all going to come down in the morning anyway. The biologist felt as if she were observing the surveyor from 1,000 miles away. She admitted the psychologist had been hypnotizing all of them, perhaps for purposes beyond their mission. The surveyor demanded how she knew this, resentful. The biologist confessed she'd become impervious to hypnosis. She'd seen the psychologist hypnotize the surveyor before they'd come down. She didn't tell her how she'd become immune. The surveyor asked why she'd done nothing, at least considering the possibility. The biologist hadn't wanted the psychologist to know she couldn't hypnotize her, and she'd wanted to come down here. The surveyor considered. The biologist urged her to be ready for anything when they went up. They might need to restrain or kill the psychologist. Why would she be planning anything? The surveyor asked. Because she must have different orders, the biologist explained. The surveyor didn't reply. The biologist thought that meant she was acclimating to the idea. She gave the surveyor her extra earplugs to help resist hypnotic suggestion. The surveyor insisted they go up together, not waiting in the dark for the biologist to fix everything. The biologist agreed, but said she'd have to stop the psychologist if she started coercing the surveyor. The surveyor asked about the body. The biologist said they'd leave her. They couldn't be weighed down and didn't know what contaminants they might carry. The surveyor nodded. She wasn't sentimental. There was nothing left of the anthropologist in that body. The biologist tried not to think of her last moments, the terror of being willed to death. Before turning back, she took one of the glass tubes strewn around the body, a trace of thick, flesh-like substance gleaming darkly golden. Perhaps the anthropologist had gotten a useful sample after all, near the end. As they ascended toward the light, she tried to distract herself by reviewing her training, searching for any clue that might lead to revelation. But she found nothing, only a growing awareness of her own gullibility in thinking she'd been told anything useful. The emphasis had always been on their own capabilities and knowledge base, and looking back, she could see an almost willful intent to obscure and misdirect, disguised as concern they not be frightened or overwhelmed. The map had been the first form of misdirection. What was a map but a way of emphasizing some things and making others invisible? They'd been directed to memorize its details for 6 months: the lighthouse's position relative to camp, distances between ruined houses, miles of coastline to explore. Almost always in the context of the lighthouse. They'd become so comfortable with the map that it stopped them from asking why or even what. Why this stretch of coast? What lay inside the lighthouse? Why was camp set back in the forest, fairly close to the tower, which didn't exist on the map, and had the base camp always been there? What lay beyond the map? Now she realized the focus on the map might itself have been an embedded cue. If they didn't ask questions, it was because they were programmed not to. The lighthouse, representative or actual, might have been a subconscious hypnotic trigger, and perhaps the epicenter of whatever had spread to become Area X. Her ecology briefing had had a similar blinkered focus. She'd spent most of her time on transitional ecosystems, flora and fauna, but also had an intense refresher on fungi and lichen that, in light of the words on the wall, now seemed the true purpose of that study. If the map was meant to distract, the ecology research had been meant to prepare her. Unless she was being paranoid, but if not, it meant they knew about the tower, perhaps had always known. Her suspicions grew. The grueling survival and weapons training had sent them to sleep most evenings. Even when they trained together, they were training apart. They'd taken away their names in the 2nd month, stripped them. Only things in Area X received names, and only in their most general labels. Another distraction from asking questions that required specific details. The right specific details, not that there were 6 species of venomous snakes. By the time they crossed the border, they knew everything and nothing. The psychologist wasn't there when they emerged into sunlight, ripping off masks and breathing fresh air. They'd been ready for almost any scenario, but not her absence. They searched the environs, certain she was hiding, half hoping to find her. Surely she had an explanation. For almost an hour they couldn't stop, until the biologist finally admitted she was gone. The surveyor suggested she might be back at camp. The biologist asked if her absence was a sign of guilt. The surveyor spat and said no, maybe something happened to her. They'd seen footprints, the body, but she just wanted to get back to camp. The biologist couldn't read her, turning on her or just cautious. Coming above ground had emboldened her. Back at camp, the surveyor's resolve crumbled again. The psychologist wasn't there, and she'd taken half their supplies and most of the guns. She was still alive. They'd lost the linguist, the anthropologist, and the psychologist less than a week into the mission. Scientists trained to observe natural phenomena, not the uncanny. The surveyor threw down her rifle, sagged into a chair, and gave up, saying she'd believe the biologist for now, because she had no choice, no better theories. She asked what they should do. The biologist emerged from the anthropologist's tent with no clues, the horror still hitting her, coerced into her own death. If she was right, the psychologist was a murderer. The surveyor repeated the question. The biologist said they'd examine samples, develop photographs, then probably go back down into the tower tomorrow. The surveyor refused. She wasn't going back down, and it was a tunnel, not a tower. She wanted to go back to the border and await extraction. They didn't have resources, and the psychologist was out there plotting, or dead or injured. The biologist said she wasn't ready to go back. The surveyor saw she preferred this place, a kind of pity in her voice, and warned that even on military maneuvers designed to simulate negative outcomes, she'd seen better odds. The biologist stole the psychologist's delaying tactics. They'd look at what they'd brought back, then decide. The surveyor could always head back tomorrow. The surveyor relented. The border was still 4 days away. The biologist didn't say what she was thinking, that the surveyor might only make it back in the abstract sense her husband had, stripped of what made her unique. The biologist spent the afternoon examining samples under the microscope. The surveyor developed photographs, frustrating for anyone used to digital, then went through maps and documents from the prior expedition. The samples told cryptic jokes she couldn't understand. The word cells had unusual structure, but fell within acceptable range. Or they were mimicking saprotrophic organisms magnificently. She'd need a sample of the wall from behind the words. The hand-shaped creature's tissue resisted interpretation. No cells, just solid amber with air bubbles. Contaminated or decomposed quickly. Another thought came too late. Having absorbed the spores, she might be causing a reaction. The sample from the anthropologist's vial she left for last. She had the surveyor look at it too, claiming possible contamination. The surveyor demanded why she'd be more contaminated than anyone else. The biologist shrugged, said she'd been first to find the words. The surveyor laughed harshly, saying they were in much deeper than that. Masks wouldn't keep them safe. The biologist thought she was wrong, but didn't correct her. She squinted through the microscope at the sample from whatever had killed the anthropologist. It was brain tissue, remarkably human, with irregularities. The surveyor's notes confirmed what she saw. The sample remained unchanged. She kept squinting, raising her head, squinting again. Was it really human? Pretending to be human? How had the anthropologist taken a brain biopsy? The sample had to come from the exterior, couldn't be brain tissue, couldn't be human. She felt unmoored, drifting. The surveyor strode over and threw the developed photographs on the table. Useless, she said. The photographs were a total loss. Every image of the fungal script had dissolved into a blur of luminous, out-of-focus color, and anything else she'd tried to capture had come back as pure, impenetrable darkness. Even the few shots that fell somewhere between the two were hopelessly blurred. She understood why, she thought. The walls were breathing, slowly and steadily, and that constant motion, combined with some unseen heat or other distorting effect, had ruined every exposure. The realization struck her with a jolt of self-recrimination. She'd recognized the words as organisms, and she'd known the walls themselves were living tissue, but her mind had still categorized them as inert structure, as something not worth sampling. The oversight felt damning. The surveyor asked, mistaking her frustrated muttering for something else, whether any of the samples had yielded results. She admitted they'd all been worthless. When she asked if the maps or papers had revealed anything, the surveyor snorted in disgust and said they'd found nothing useful, just a fixation on the lighthouse, a recurring obsession with watching it, going to it, even living in it. So they had nothing, she concluded. The surveyor ignored that and asked, with clear reluctance, what they should do next. She suggested they eat dinner, check the perimeter for any sign of the psychologist, and spend the night thinking about tomorrow. But the surveyor immediately drew a hard line. She would not go back into the tunnel. She corrected her, insisting it was a tower, and the surveyor just glared at her. There was no point in continuing the argument. They ate in silence as dusk settled over the camp. The strange moaning from the marshes had begun, but she barely registered it, too focused on her meal. The food tasted astonishingly good, rich and satisfying in a way she couldn't explain. She ate quickly, going back for seconds while the surveyor watched her with baffled suspicion. They had nothing to say to each other. Talking would have meant planning, and the surveyor wouldn't like any plan she proposed. The wind picked up, bringing rain. She watched each drop fall with unnerving clarity, each one a perfect, faceted diamond refracting light in the gloom. She could smell the sea, Picture the churning waves. The wind felt alive, slipping into every pore, carrying the earthy scent of marsh reeds. She tried to ignore the changes in the tower's confined space, but her senses were too sharp now, too acute. She was adapting, but moments like this reminded her that she'd been someone else just a day ago. They decided to take turns standing watch. Leaving the perimeter unguarded felt too dangerous, especially since the psychologist knew where every tripwire was placed and they had no time to disarm and reset them. She let the surveyor take the first watch as a gesture of trust. In the middle of the night, the surveyor came to wake her, but she was already awake. The thunder had roused her. The surveyor stumbled off to bed, grumbling. She doubted the surveyor trusted her, but exhaustion had clearly won out over suspicion. The rain grew heavier. She wasn't worried about the tents. They were military grade, built to withstand far worse. But since she was awake anyway, she wanted to feel the storm. She stepped outside into the stinging rain and gusting wind. The surveyor was already snoring in her tent, sleeping through the chaos. The dim emergency lights cast the tents as triangles of shadow against the darkness. Even the night itself felt more alive to her now, pressing in like something physical. Not necessarily sinister, but tangible. She wondered if that was just the storm. In that moment, the whole world felt like a dream. The training, her former life, everything she'd left behind. None of it mattered. Only this place, this moment, mattered. And it wasn't hypnosis that made her feel that way. The emotion gripped her as she stared toward the coast, through the jagged gaps between the trees. A greater darkness gathered there, the convergence of night, clouds, and sea. Somewhere beyond lay another border. Then she saw it, a flicker of orange light, too high in the sky to be anything on the ground. It had to be the lighthouse. The light moved left and upward, vanished, reappeared minutes later even higher, and then went out for good. She waited for it to return, but it never did. The longer the darkness held, the more restless she became. In this strange place, any light felt like a sign of civilization, and its absence gnawed at her. It reminded her of the stormy day she'd spent alone with her husband after he'd returned from the 11th expedition. That day had felt surreal, familiar routine wrapped in an eerie calm, more pronounced than even the distance that had grown between them before he left. In the weeks before the expedition, they'd fought violently. She'd shoved him against a wall, thrown things, desperate to break through his armor of resolve. Resolve that might have been implanted by hypnotic suggestion. She'd warned him he might not come back, and she couldn't promise she'd be waiting if he did. He'd laughed off her threat, asking if she'd been waiting all this time. He was already set on his course, and obstacles only made him more stubborn, more determined. That was his nature. An impulse became a compulsion, especially when he believed he was serving a greater cause. It was why he'd re-enlisted in the Navy. Their relationship had been fraying for a while. He was gregarious. She craved solitude. That difference had once been their strength, but it had worn them down. She'd admired his confidence, his outgoing nature, his humor. When they met in a crowded park, he'd broken through her reserve by pretending they were detectives on a stakeout, spinning stories about the people around them. He'd found her mysterious at first, her guardedness a puzzle he wanted to solve. He'd even admitted during one fight that his volunteering for the expedition was a reaction to her pushing him away, though he'd later taken it back, ashamed. She told him plainly that there was no hidden person inside her. She was exactly who she seemed, and that would never change. She told him about the overgrown swimming pool from her childhood, back when they lay in bed together in the early days. He'd been captivated, ignoring the isolation it revealed, and focusing instead on the pool itself. He said he would have sailed boats on it. She joked that the frogs, old Flopper, would have been the captains. He teased that he would have found her grim and willful. She said she would have wished for the turtles to sink his boat. He said he'd have rebuilt it and told everyone about the grim kid who talked to frogs. She never talked to frogs. She despised anthropomorphizing animals. He said he would have liked her anyway, followed her anywhere. They'd fit together, opposites who took pride in their differences, reveling in that dynamic until marriage broke the wave and they washed apart in depressingly familiar ways. None of it mattered when he returned from the expedition. She asked no questions, didn't bring up old arguments. She knew the time they had together was already running out. She made him breakfast while rain beat against the windows. They sat at the kitchen table, the backyard visible through the sliding doors, and had an excruciatingly polite conversation. He admired the bird feeder she'd installed and the rain-rippled water feature. She asked if he'd slept well, how he felt, even repeated questions from the night before about whether the journey back had been difficult. He said it had been effortless, flashing a smile that wasn't quite his. He said it had taken no time at all. She couldn't read his expression, but behind its blankness, she sensed something mournful, something that wanted to reach out but couldn't. Her husband had never been mournful, and that frightened her. He asked about her work, and she told him about her job developing products to break down plastics. Boring, but stable. He mentioned his own work as if he'd only been gone a few weeks, as if she were a colleague, not his wife. He drank his orange juice with an intensity that consumed the moment, then asked casually about improvements to the house. After breakfast, they sat on the porch watching the rain, read for a while, then went inside and made love. A repetitive, almost trance-like act, comfortable only because the weather cocooned them. She couldn't pretend any longer that he was fully present. Lunch came, then television. She found a sailing race for him, and more banal talk. He asked about friends she never saw, friends that had never really been hers. They tried a board game, laughing at silly questions, but then odd gaps in his knowledge appeared, and they stopped, a silence settling between them. He read the paper, caught up on magazines, watched the news, but she suspected he was only going through the motions. When the rain stopped, she woke from a nap to find him gone. Panic gripped her as she searched the house. Then she found him outside, standing in front of the boat he loved, the one that wouldn't fit in the garage. He stared at it with a puzzled, forlorn expression, as if he could remember its importance but not why. He didn't acknowledge her when she came and curled her arm around his. She could feel him trying to recall something vital, something that, she'd realized much later, had to do with her. If he could have remembered, he might have told her something important. They stood there, together yet apart, the heat and weight of him beside her, his breathing steady. She couldn't bear it anymore, the directionless distress, the silence. She let him back inside. He didn't resist. He didn't look back at the boat. That was when she made her decision, she thought later. If he'd only looked back, if he'd resisted even for a moment, things might have been different. They came for him at dinner, in the final moments of his meal, 4 or 5 unmarked cars and a surveillance van pulling up outside. There was no rough handling, no shouting, no display of handcuffs or weapons. They approached him with a kind of respect that bordered on fear, the careful, watchful gentleness of someone handling an unexploded bomb. He went without protest, and she let them take this stranger from her house. She couldn't have stopped them, but more than that, she didn't want to. The last few hours of coexistence had been a rising panic, each atypical word and gesture driving her further from the memory of the man she'd known. Preserving that memory had become more important than holding on to the shell that had returned. She'd called the emergency number he'd left because she didn't know what else to do with him. Watching him leave, she felt mostly relief. She visited him in the observation facility until the very end. Even under hypnosis in those taped interviews, he revealed nothing new, unless the real answers had been kept from her. What she remembered most was the repetitive sadness of his words, a description of walking forever on the path from border to base camp, of the journey taking a long time and promising to take even longer to return, of being utterly alone, of trees that weren't trees and birds that weren't birds, of no longer being himself but merely something that had been walking for a very long time. That was all she truly discovered in him after his return, a deep and unending solitude, a gift he didn't know what to do with, a gift that was poison and eventually killed him. But she wondered if it would have killed her. The question crept into her mind even as she stared into his eyes in those final visits, willing herself to understand his thoughts and failing. Back in her sterile lab, at her increasingly repetitive job, she kept thinking about Area X. She realized she would never truly know what it was like without going there. No account could substitute for the experience. Months after her husband died, she volunteered for an expedition. A spouse of a former member had never signed up before, and she suspected they accepted her partly to see if that connection would make a difference, as an experiment. Or perhaps they'd expected her to sign up from the start. By morning, the rain had stopped and the sky was a searing, cloudless blue. Only the debris, pine needles scattered across the tents, dirty puddles, fallen branches, marked the storm's passage. The brightness she'd sensed before had spread to her chest, a prickling energy and anticipation that pushed against her exhaustion. She couldn't tell if it was part of the change, but it didn't matter. There was no way to fight it anyway. She had a decision to make: the lighthouse or the tower. Part of the brightness wanted to descend into darkness immediately, an act of sheer, reckless faith. But she'd seen light in the lighthouse the night before, and if the psychologist had taken refuge there, tracking her down might offer insight into the tower before she explored further. The unknowns had multiplied tenfold. By the time she spoke to the surveyor, she'd decided on the lighthouse. The morning felt like a fresh start, but it wasn't to be. The surveyor had no interest in the lighthouse any more than she'd had in the tower. When she asked if the surveyor didn't want to find out if the psychologist was there, the surveyor gave her a look of pure incredulity. Why would she want to confront someone holed up in a high position with clear sightlines and a weapons cache? She'd take her chances at camp. If she were smart, she'd do the same. The surveyor dismissed the idea with brutal practicality. Her stubbornness tore at her. She didn't want to split up. Practical reasons, the weapons cache, and the fear that the surveyor would head for the border without her. She tried to sidestep the issue, saying it was either the lighthouse or the tower, and finding the psychologist first would be better. She'd seen what killed the anthropologist, knew more than she'd told them. But the surveyor folded her arms and declared the mission over. Her opposition, her smugness, ignited an anger she couldn't suppress. She did something she regretted. She parroted one of the psychologist's hypnotic cues, trying to sound casual, but a shudder passed over the surveyor's face. A moment of disorientation followed by clarity. The look in her eyes told her she understood exactly what she'd tried to do. She'd learned that the cues only worked for the psychologist. The surveyor accused her of being willing to do anything to get her way, and she had no defense. The surveyor held the rifle. What weapon did she really have? She told herself she'd suggested it to give the anthropologist's death meaning. When she didn't reply, the surveyor sighed and revealed what she'd figured out while developing those useless photographs. What bothered her most? It wasn't the thing in the tunnel or her conduct or anything the psychologist had done. It was the rifle. 30-year-old parts cobbled together. Everything they'd brought was old junk, restored crap from decades past. They'd been living in a reenactment, and she didn't even know why. She registered the information as a mild surprise in the hierarchy of discoveries. She asked if the surveyor would remain until she returned. The surveyor's reply came too quickly, too dismissively. She warned her not to say anything she couldn't back up. The surveyor told her to fuck off. That was how they left it. The surveyor leaning back in her chair, assault rifle in hand, as she set out to investigate the light she'd seen the night before. She carried a knapsack of food and water, 2 guns, sampling equipment, and a microscope. Oddly, the microscope made her feel safer. Part of her welcomed the chance to explore alone, free from dependency and worry. She looked back twice before the trail twisted away. The surveyor remained seated, staring at her like a distorted reflection of who she'd been days before. A strange mood took hold as she walked through the final stretch of pines and cypress knees floating in black water, draped in gray moss. It was as if an intense aria played in her ears, every detail infused with emotion. She was no longer a biologist, but the crest of a wave building endlessly but never breaking. She saw the transition to marsh and salt flats with new eyes. The trail became a raised berm, algae-choked lake spreading right and a canal on the left. Channels of water meandered through reeds, and islands of wind-contorted trees appeared in the distance like revelations, their stooped, blackened shapes stark against the shimmering gold-brown of the reeds. The strange quality of light, the stillness, the sense of waiting, brought her close to ecstasy. The lighthouse stood beyond, and before it, the remains of a village. The trail was strewn with tortured pieces of white driftwood hurled inland by past hurricanes. Red grasshoppers swarmed the long grass, with only a few frogs to feed on them, and flattened grass tunnels marked where huge reptiles had slid back into the water after sunning themselves. Raptors circled above in geometric patterns, scanning for prey. In that timeless cocoon, with the lighthouse remaining stubbornly distant, she had time to think. She felt she'd abdicated her responsibility to consider the tower's contents as part of a vast biological entity, possibly not even terrestrial. But contemplating the enormity of that idea would have shattered her mood like an avalanche. So she focused on specifics. An organism was writing living words along the interior walls, perhaps for a very long time. Whole ecosystems had been born and flourished among the words, dying off as the words faded. A side effect of creating viable habitat, important only in what the creature's adaptations could tell her about the tower. The spores she'd inhaled, for example, pointed to a truthful seeing. The thought brought her up short. She'd assumed the psychologist had hypnotized her into seeing the tower as a physical structure, and the spores had made her resistant to that suggestion. But what if the process was more complex? What if the tower emanated its own effect, a defensive mimicry, and the spores had made her immune to that illusion instead? From that broader perspective, questions multiplied faster than answers. She'd decided to call the maker of words the crawler, naming it felt important, a way to anchor the mystery. But its role remained unclear, as did the purpose of the physical recitation. Did the actual words matter, or would any words serve? Where had they originated? And what was the interplay between the words and the tower creature itself? Some form of symbiotic or parasitic communication. Either the crawler was an emissary of the tower, or it had existed independently and entered its orbit later. Without the missing sample of the tower wall, she couldn't even begin to guess. She returned to the words themselves, their strange biblical cadence. Wasps and birds and other nest builders often used a core, irreplaceable material, but incorporated whatever was nearby. This might explain the seeming randomness of the words. They were just building material. Perhaps that was why high-tech equipment was forbidden in Area X. The occupying force might use it in unknown and powerful ways. New ideas detonated as she watched a marsh hawk dive into the reeds and emerge with a struggling rabbit. The words, their physical line, might be absolutely essential to the well-being of the tower or the crawler, or both. The faint skeletons of past writings suggested a biological imperative behind the crawler's work, possibly feeding into the reproductive cycle of one or both entities. Perhaps words didn't matter because the process was fertilization, completed only when the entire left-hand wall held a line of writing. Despite her attempt to sustain the area in her head, she experienced a jarring return to reality. Too many variables, not enough data, and she was making assumptions that might be false. She'd assumed neither crawler nor tower possessed free will, but ritual in certain cultures suggested other possibilities. She longed for the anthropologist's expertise now, even though studying social insects had given her some insight into similar areas. If not ritual, then communication, this time in a conscious sense. Perhaps the crawler went far afield to gather words, assimilating them before returning to the tower. The sentences on the walls could be evidence brought back for analysis. But there was a limit to thinking about even a small piece of something monumental. The shadow of the whole reared up behind her, and she became lost in the panic of realizing the size of that imagined Leviathan. She compartmentalized it, promising to write it all down later and divine the true meaning from the page. The lighthouse had finally grown larger on the horizon, and the surveyor had been right about one thing. Anyone inside would see her coming for miles. The brightness in her chest continued to sculpt her as she walked. By the time she reached the deserted village, halfway to the lighthouse, She felt she could run a marathon. She didn't trust that feeling. In so many ways, she felt she was being lied to. She'd often thought during training about the preternatural calm of the 11th Expedition's members and the benign reporting from the 1st Expedition Area X, before the ill-defined event that locked it behind the border 30 years ago, had been a wilderness adjacent to a military base. People still lived there, not many tight-lipped descendants of fisherfolk, and their disappearance might have seemed like an intensifying of a process begun generations before. When Area X first appeared, there was vagueness and confusion. The government emphasized a localized environmental catastrophe from experimental military research, leaking the story gradually so that people absorbed it as part of the daily noise of ecological devastation. Within a year or two, it became the province of conspiracy theorists. By the time she volunteered and received security clearance, Area X lingered in many minds like a dark fairy tale, something they didn't want to think about too closely. During training, they were told the first expedition went in 2 years after the event, after scientists found a way to breach the border. They set up the base camp perimeter and provided a rough map, confirming landmarks. They found a pristine wilderness devoid of human life, a preternatural silence. One member described feeling both freer and more constrained, as if they could do anything as long as they didn't mind being watched. Others mentioned euphoria and extremes of sexual desire. Anomalies lurked at the fringes. They never saw the expedition's journals, only recorded interviews, which hinted at avoidance of direct experience. Descriptions of the abandoned village seemed inconsistent. The warping and ruination suggested abandonment far longer than a few years. Any such observation had been stricken from the record. She was convinced now that they'd been given access to these records because for certain classified information, it didn't matter what they knew. Experience told their superiors that few, if any of them, would be coming back. The deserted village had sunk so deeply into the natural landscape that she didn't see it until she was upon it. The trail dipped into a depression, and there lay the village, fringed by stunted trees. Only a few roofs remained on the 12 or 13 houses, and the trail had crumbled into porous rubble. Some outer walls still stood, dark rotting wood splotched with lichen, but most had fallen away, leaving glimpses of interiors. Remains of chairs and tables, a child's toys, rotted clothing, ceiling beams covered in moss and vines. A sharp chemical smell hung in the air, and dead animals decomposed into the mulch. Some houses had slid into the canal over time, their skeletal remains like creatures struggling to leave the water. It all seemed like something that had happened a century ago. But in what had been kitchens or living rooms, she saw peculiar eruptions of moss or lichen, rising 4 or 5 feet tall, misshapen, the vegetative matter forming approximations of limbs, heads, and torsos. One tableau struck her almost emotionally. 4 such eruptions, 1 standing and 3 decomposed enough to appear sitting in what must have been a living room, facing a point where only the crumbling remains of a fireplace and chimney lay. The smell of lime and mint cut through the must and loam. She didn't want to speculate on its meaning. No sense of peace emanated from the place, only something unresolved. She moved on but took samples. A piece of moss from a forehead, splinters of wood, scrapings from dead animals, a curled, dried fox, and a rat that must have died a day or 2 before. Just after leaving the village, a double line cut through the canal water toward her. Binoculars were useless against the glare. She pulled out her gun. Then the dolphins breached, a vivid dislocation like that first descent into the tower. She knew dolphins sometimes ventured in from the sea here, adapted to fresh water, but surprise still struck when the nearest one rolled, and an eye stared at her that didn't resemble a dolphin's. It was painfully human, almost familiar. Then they submerged again, and she had no way to verify what she'd seen. She watched the twin lines disappear up the canal toward the village, unsettled by the thought that the natural world around her had become camouflage. She continued toward the lighthouse, which now loomed larger and more authoritarian with its black and white stripes topped with red. She would have no shelter before reaching it. She would stand out to whoever watched from that vantage, something unnatural and foreign, perhaps a threat. It was almost noon when she reached the lighthouse. She'd drunk water and eaten a snack, but weariness had caught up with her, the lack of sleep perhaps, and the last 300 yards were tense. She kept a gun out, held low, though it would be useless against a high-powered rifle. She watched the little window halfway up and the large panoramic windows at the top for any movement. The lighthouse stood just before a natural crest of dunes that curled like a wave facing the ocean. The beach spread out beyond. Up close, it had clearly been converted into a fortress, a fact conveniently left out of training. No trees grew along the trail from about a quarter-mile out. She'd found only old stumps. From an eighth mile away, her binoculars revealed a 10-foot circular wall rising from the landward side, clearly not part of the original construction. On the seaward side, another wall, stouter and high on the crumbling dune, topped with broken glass, with crenellations for rifle lines of sight. It looked ready to fall onto the beach, but the foundations must have been dug deep. Some past defenders had been at war with the sea, a specific kind of insanity evident in the fortifications. Someone had rappelled down the lighthouse's sides and attached jagged glass shards with strong adhesive, starting a third of the way up and continuing to just below the beacon. A metal collar extended 2 or 3 feet out at that point, enhanced with rusty barbed wire. The defensive wall on the landward side had crumbled with years of neglect, and a large, irregular hole led to the front door, which had exploded inward, only fragments of wood still clinging to rusted hinges. A purple flowering vine had colonized the wall and curled around the door's remains on the left. There was comfort in that. Whatever violence had occurred here must have happened long ago. But the darkness beyond the threshold made her wary. She remembered the floor plan from training. 3 outer rooms on the bottom level, stairs leading up somewhere to the left and to the right, rooms opening into a back area with at least one more larger space. Plenty of hiding places. She picked up a stone and half threw, half rolled it onto the floor beyond the crushed double doors. It clacked and spun across tile before disappearing from view. No other sound, no movement, no breathing beyond her own. Gun still drawn, she entered as quietly as she could, sliding her shoulder along the left-hand wall, searching for the stairway entrance. The outer rooms were empty. Wind was muffled, walls thick. Only 2 small windows brought light inside, forcing her to use her flashlight. As her eyes adjusted, the sense of devastation and loneliness grew. The purple vine ended just inside, unable to thrive in the darkness. No chairs, no personal effects, just dirt and debris on the tiled floor. In the middle of a wide open space, she found the stairs. No one stood there, but she had the impression someone could have been there a moment before. She considered climbing to the top first, then decided against it. Better to clear the area now, like the surveyor with her military training, even though someone could always enter through the front door while she was upstairs. The back room told a different story. Here, stout oak tables had been overturned into defensive barricades, some riddled with bullet holes, others half melted or shredded by gunfire. Beyond them, dark splotches on walls and pooled on the floor spoke of unspeakable violence. Dust and the cool, flat smell of slow decay settled over everything. Rat droppings and signs of a cot or bed in a corner suggested someone had slept here later, though who could have rested among such reminders of a massacre? Someone had carved initials into one table. RS was here. The marks looked fresher than the rest, a bravado act to drown out fear. She headed back to the stairs, putting her gun away for balance, though she wished for the surveyor's assault rifle. The ascent was strange, contrasting with her descents into the tower. The brackish light against graying walls was less oppressive than the tower's phosphorescence, but what she found unnerved her just as much. More bloodstains, thick smudges, dribbles, sprays, as if people had bled out trying to escape attackers from below. Words were written on the walls, but nothing like the tower's script. Initials, obscene pictures, personal phrases, longer hints of supplies and desperation. Confessions scrawled in the shadow of death, so many needing to communicate so little. On the stairs, a discarded shoe, an automatic pistol magazine, moldy vials of rotted samples, a crucifix, a soggy clipboard with a rusted metal clip, and worst of all, a dilapidated toy rabbit with ragged ears. Perhaps a smuggled good luck charm. There had been no children in Area X since the border came down, as far as she knew. At roughly the halfway point, she reached a landing, where she'd first seen the flicker of light the night before. Silence still dominated, no hint of movement above. Blood spatter abruptly cut off, though bullet holes riddled the walls. Casings littered the floor, swept to the sides, leaving the path clear. To the left lay a stack of guns and rifles, some ancient, some non-military. Hard to tell if anyone had touched them recently. She wondered when she'd encounter a blunderbuss or some other terrible joke. Otherwise, just dust and mold, and a tiny square window looking down on the beach and reeds. Opposite it, a faded photograph in a broken frame, dangling from a nail. Smudged, cracked glass, half covered in green mold. The black and white image showed two men at the lighthouse's base, a girl off to the side. A circle had been drawn around one man, about 50, wearing a fisherman's cap, a sharp eagle's eye gleaming from a heavy face, the left eye lost to a squint, a thick beard hiding his chin. He neither smiled nor frowned. She knew a lighthouse keeper when she saw one, but there was something else, perhaps the way dust framed his face, that made her think of him as the lighthouse keeper. Or she'd spent too long in this place, her mind seeking answers even to simple questions. The lighthouse behind them was bright and sharp, the door in good repair. She wondered when the photo was taken, how many years between it and the start of everything, how many years the keeper had kept his schedule, lived in that community, gone to the local pub. Perhaps he'd had a wife, a daughter. Perhaps he'd been popular, or solitary, or both. None of it had mattered in the end. She stared at him across the years, trying to read from the moldy photograph, the line of his jaw, the reflection in his eyes, how he might have reacted, what his last hours might have been like. Perhaps he'd left in time, but probably not. Perhaps he was moldering on the ground floor. Or, with a shudder, maybe he was waiting for her above. She took the photograph, shoved it in her pocket. The lighthouse keeper would come with her, though he hardly counted as a good luck charm. As she left the landing, she had the peculiar thought that she wasn't the first to pocket the photo, that someone would always come behind to replace it, to circle the lighthouse keeper again. Higher up, more signs of violence, but no more bodies. The mustiness gave way to sweat and soap, debris thinned, walls cleaned. By the time she bent through the last narrow steps into the lantern room, she was sure she'd find someone staring at her. She drew her gun again, but no one was there. Just chairs, a rickety table with a rug beneath it, and the surprising intactness of the thick glass. The beacon glass lay dull and dormant in the center. She could see for miles in every direction. She stood there, looking back at the trail, the distant shadow of the village, the marsh and scrubland, the dunes and sea oats, the glittering beach and surf. A second look revealed strands of black smoke from base camp. Could have meant anything, but from the tower's location, she saw a brightness of its own, a refracted phosphorescence that agitated her. She was certain no one else could see it. She searched the chairs and table. After about 5 minutes, she pulled back the rug, revealing a square trapdoor with a latch set into the wood. She pushed the table aside with a terrible rending sound, then threw open the trapdoor, shouting that she had a gun, aiming with one hand and her flashlight with the other. The weight of her gun dropped to the floor, her flashlight shaking, but she held on. She couldn't believe what she was staring at. The trapdoor opened onto a space 15 feet deep and 30 feet wide. The psychologist's knapsack, weapons, water, and flashlight lay to the left, but no sign of the psychologist herself. What made her gasp, what felt like a punch to her stomach, was the huge mound dominating the space. An insane midden of papers with hundreds of journals on top, just like the ones they'd been issued, each with a job title on the front, each filled with writing. Many more than could possibly have been filed by only 12 expeditions. Her best field assignment out of college had taken her to a remote western coast, a curled hook of land at civilization's farthest extremity, where temperate and Arctic climates met. The earth had disgorged huge rock formations, and old-growth rainforests sprouted around them, perpetually moist with over 70 inches of rain a year. The air was clean, the vegetation dense and richly green, bears and panthers and elk roaming the forests. She lived in a village of 300 souls near the coast, renting a cottage beside a house that had belonged to 5 generations of fisherfolk, a childless husband and wife with a severe laconic quality. She made no friends there, finding camaraderie only in the local pub after a few pints, though violence lived there too, and she kept away. She was 4 years from meeting her future husband, not looking for anything from anyone. Every day she drove the hellish winding road, rutted and treacherous, even when dry, to a place called Rock Bay. There, sheets of magma beyond the rough beaches had been worn smooth over millions of years, pitted with tidal pools. At low tide in the morning, she photographed those pools, took measurements, cataloged the life within them, sometimes staying through part of high tide, wading in rubber boots as spray from waves smashing over the ledge drenched her. A species of mussels found nowhere else lived there in symbiosis with a fish called a gartner. Several marine snails and sea anemones lurked there too, along with a tough little squid she'd nicknamed Saint Pugnacious. The white flashing luminescence of its danger display made its mantle look like a pope's hat. She could lose hours there, observing the hidden life of tidal pools, marveling at the gift of losing herself in the present moment so utterly, and having such solitude, all she'd ever craved. But during the drives back, she grieved the anticipated end of this happiness. The research grant was only for 2 years. Who would care about mussels longer than that? And her methods could be eccentric. As the expiration date neared and prospects dimmed, she began spending more time in the pub. She'd wake with a fuzzy head, sometimes with someone she knew but who was a stranger just leaving, realizing she was one day closer to the end. Running through it was a sense of relief, the thought that this way she wouldn't become that person the locals saw out on the rocks and still thought of as an outsider. The old biologist who'd been here for ages, going crazy studying mussels, muttering to herself. When she saw those hundreds of journals, she felt for a long moment that she had become that old biologist after all. That's how the madness of the world tries to colonize you, from the outside in, forcing you to live in its reality. Reality encroached in other ways too. Her husband had begun calling her the ghost bird, teasing her for not being present enough, a crease at the corner of his lips that almost formed a smile, but reproach in his eyes. In bars with his friends, she volunteered only what a prisoner might during interrogation. They weren't her friends. She wasn't in the habit of small talk or broad talk. She didn't care about politics, except where it impinged on the environment, wasn't religious. All her hobbies were bound up in her work. She lived for it and thrilled at the power of that focus, but it was deeply personal and she didn't like to talk about it. She didn't wear makeup, didn't care about fashion or music. His friends probably found her taciturn, or worse, she'd overheard someone call her strangely uneducated, though she didn't know if he meant her. She enjoyed bars, but not for the same reasons as her husband. She loved the late-night slow burn of being out, her mind turning over problems while appearing sociable but existing apart. He worried too much about her. Her need for solitude ate into his enjoyment of talking to friends. She'd see him trail off, gazing at her for a sign of contentment, while she drank her whiskey neat. He'd ask if she'd had fun, and she'd nod and smile. But fun for her was sneaking off to peer into a tidal pool, grasping the intricacies of creatures. Sustenance was tied to ecosystem and habitat. Orgasm was the sudden realization of interconnectivity. Observation always meant more than interaction. He knew all this, she thought, but she could never express it well, although she tried and he listened. Yet she was nothing but expression in other ways. Her sole gift was that places could impress themselves upon her, and she could become part of them with ease. Even a bar was a crude ecosystem, and to someone entering without her husband's agenda, she'd have seemed happy in her bubble of silence. Even as her husband wanted her to assimilate, the irony was that he wanted to stand out. Seeing the pile of journals, she thought of this. He'd been wrong for the 11th expedition because of this quality. Here were the indiscriminate accounts of so many souls. His couldn't possibly stand out. In the end, he'd been reduced to a state that approximated her own. Those journals, flimsy gravestones, confronted her with his death all over again. She dreaded finding his, dreading knowing his true account, not the featureless mutterings he'd given upon his return. He'd once whispered in the dark, before expedition training, asking if she loved him, if she needed him. She loved him but didn't need him, and she thought that was how it should be. A ghost bird might be a hawk in one place, a crow in another. The sparrow that shot up one morning might transform into an osprey. This was the way of things here. No reasons were so mighty they could override the desire to be in accord with the tides and seasons. The journals formed a moldering pile about 12 feet high and 16 feet wide, near the bottom turned to compost with paper rotting away. Beetles, silverfish, and tiny black cockroaches tended the archives. At the base, spilling out at the edges, she saw the remains of photographs and dozens of ruined cassette tapes mixed with pulp, along with evidence of rats. She'd have to lower herself down by the ladder, nailed to the trapdoor's lip, and trudge through a collapsing garbage hill of disintegrating pulp to uncover anything. The scene embodied the scrap of writing from the tower wall about seeds of the dead shared with worms gathering in darkness. She overturned the table and laid it across the stairwell entrance, not wanting the psychologist or anyone else surprising her. If someone tried to move it, she'd hear and have time to climb up. She also sensed a presence pressing up from below, a prickling across her skin at unexpected times, something she could now attribute to the brightness growing within her. She didn't like that the psychologist had stashed her gear down with the journals, including most or all of her weapons. But for now, she had to put that puzzle aside, along with the tremors from knowing most of the Southern Reach's training had been a lie. As she lowered herself into that cool, dark space, the brightness's pull became even more acute. Her flashlight and the natural light from the open trapdoor revealed walls rife with mold striations forming dull stripes of red and green. From below, the midden's ripples and hillocks of paper became more apparent. Torn pages, crushed pages, warped and damp journal covers. Slowly, the history of exploring Area X was turning into Area X. She picked around the edges, choosing journals at random. Most depicted ordinary events like the first expeditions, which couldn't have been the first. Some were extraordinary only because the dates didn't make sense. How many expeditions had really come across the border? How much information had been doctored and suppressed, and for how long? Did 12 expeditions refer only to the latest iteration of a longer effort? Pre-expedition accounts existed too. Audio cassettes, chewed photographs, decomposing folders of papers, all oppressed by the weight of journals on top, suffused with a dull, damp smell masking sharp decay. Typewritten, printed, and handwritten words piled up in her head like a mental facsimile of the midden itself. The clutter brought her close to freezing. She made rules. Ignore shorthand and code, skim rather than read straight through. But sampling was sometimes worse. She found pages describing unspeakable acts, entries mentioning periods of remission and cessation followed by flare-ups and horrible manifestations. For years before the border, strange things had happened along this coast, a proto-Area X. Omissions itched as much as explicit offerings. One journal, half destroyed by damp, focused solely on a thistle with lavender blossoms growing in the hinterlands. Page after page described encountering specimens and the insects and creatures in that microhabitat. The observer never strayed more than a foot or two from a plant, never pulled back to show base camp or their own life. Unease crept over her as she perceived a terrible presence hovering in the background, the crawler or some surrogate approaching just beyond the thistle, the single focus a way of coping with horror. With each new depiction, a shiver worked deeper into her spine. When the latter part dissolved into ruined ink and pulp, she was almost relieved to be rid of that unnerving repetition. If there had been an endless number of pages, she feared she'd have read forever, until she died of thirst or starvation. She began to wonder if the absence of references to the tower fit this theory, writing around the edges of things. After several banal or incomprehensible samples, she found a journal that wasn't the same type as her own. It dated back to before the first expedition, but after the border came down, referencing building the wall, the fortification facing the sea. A page later, mixed with meteorological readings, 3 words leapt out: repelling an attack. The writer at first gave no details about the attackers, but the assault had come from the sea and left 4 dead, though the wall held. Later, desperation grew. The desolation came from the sea again with strange lights, marine life battering against the wall at high tide, outliers creeping in through gaps at night. They held, but ammunition was running out. Some wanted to abandon the lighthouse for the island or inland, but the commander had orders. Morale was low. Not everything happening had a rational explanation. The account trailed off into nothing, leaving behind a distinctly unreal quality, as if she'd read a fictionalized version of a real event. She tried to imagine what Area X might have looked like so long ago, but she couldn't. The lighthouse had drawn expedition members like ships it had once sought to guide to safety through offshore narrows and reefs. To most of them, she speculated, it was a symbol of the old order, a reassuring illusion of safe refuge, that it had betrayed that trust was manifest in what she'd found downstairs. Yet even knowing that, still they came, out of hope, faith, or stupidity. She'd begun to realize that to fight whatever force inhabited Area X, you had to wage a guerrilla war. You had to fade into the landscape, or like the writer of the Thistle Chronicles, pretend it wasn't there for as long as possible. To acknowledge it, to name it, might be a way of letting it in. For the same reason, she'd continued to refer to the changes in herself as a brightness. Examining it too closely, quantifying it when she had little control, would make it too real. At some point, panic set in at the sheer volume before her. She refined her focus, searched only for phrases identical or similar in tone to the words on the tower wall. She assailed the hill of paper more directly, wading into the middle sections, the rectangle of light above reassuring her this wasn't the sum of her existence. She rummaged like the rats and silverfish, shoving her arms in and coming out with whatever she could grasp, losing balance and becoming buried in papers, nostrils full of rot, tongue tasting it. She knew she'd look unhinged to anyone watching from above. She found what she was looking for in more journals than expected, usually the opening phrase about strangling fruit and seeds of the dead. Often it appeared as scrawled margin notes or disconnected from surrounding text. Once, it was documented as a phrase on the lighthouse wall itself, quickly washed away for no given reason. Another time, in spidery handwriting, a reference to text in a logbook that read like Old Testament scripture, but from no remembered psalm. It had to refer to the crawler's writing, but none of it brought her closer to understanding why or who. They were all in the dark, scrabbling at the pile of journals. If ever she felt the weight of her predecessors, it was there, lost in it all. Soon she was so overwhelmed she couldn't continue. Too much data, too anecdotal. She could search for years and never uncover the right secrets, caught in a loop of wondering how long this place had existed, who had first left journals, why others had followed until it became an inexorable ritual. What impulse, what shared fatalism? All she really knew was that journals from certain expeditions and members were missing. The record was incomplete. She'd have to return to base camp before nightfall or stay at the lighthouse. Traveling in the dark was unappealing, and if she didn't return, the surveyor might abandon her and try to cross the border. She decided on one last effort. With difficulty, she climbed to the top of the midden, trying not to dislodge journals. It was like a roiling monster beneath her boots, unwilling to bear her weight without resistance. But she made it up. As she'd imagined, the top journals were more recent, and she immediately found those from her husband's expedition. With a lurch in her stomach, she kept rummaging, knowing what she'd inevitably stumble upon. Stuck to the back of another journal by dried blood or some substance, she found it more easily than she'd expected. Her husband's journal, in the confident, bold handwriting she knew from birthday cards, notes, and shopping lists. The ghost bird had found his ghost on an inexplicable pile of other ghosts. Rather than looking forward to reading it, she felt like she was stealing a private diary locked by his death. A stupid feeling, she knew. All he'd ever wanted was for her to open up to him. He'd always been there for the taking. Now she'd have to take him as she found him, probably forever, and the truth of that was intolerable. She couldn't bring herself to read it yet, but fought the urge to throw it back and instead put it with the handful of other journals she planned to take to base camp. She also retrieved 2 of the psychologist's guns as she climbed out of that wretched space, leaving other supplies for now. A cache might be useful. It was later than she'd thought when she emerged. The sky was deep amber, late afternoon. The sea blazed with light, but nothing beautiful here fooled her anymore. Human lives had poured into this place over time, volunteered for exile and worse. Under everything lay the ghastly presence of countless desperate struggles. Why did they keep sending expeditions? Why did they keep going? So many lies, so little ability to face the truth. Area X broke minds, she felt, though it hadn't yet broken hers. A line from a song kept coming back. All this useless knowledge. After being in that space so long, she needed fresh air. She dropped what she'd taken into a chair and opened the sliding door onto the circular ledge. The wind tore at her clothes and slapped her face. The sudden chill was cleansing, the view even better. She could see forever. But some instinct or premonition made her look straight down, past the defensive wall's remains, to the beach, partly hidden by the dune's curve and the wall's height even from that angle. Emerging from that space was a foot and the end of a leg amid disrupted sand. She trained her binoculars on the unmoving foot. Familiar pant leg, familiar boot, laces double-tied and even. She gripped the railing against vertigo. She knew the owner of that boot. It was the psychologist. Everything she knew about the psychologist came from observations during training. She'd served as distant overseer and personal confessor, except she had nothing to confess. Perhaps she confessed more under hypnosis, but during regular sessions, which she'd agreed to as a condition of acceptance, she volunteered little. When asked about her parents, she said they were normal, though she thought of them as distant, impractical, irrelevant, moody, useless. When the psychologist pressed, suggesting her mother was an alcoholic, her father a con man, she almost protested, wanting to say her mother was an artist and her father an entrepreneur. "What are your earliest memories?" "Breakfast." But she also thought of a stuffed puppy toy, putting a magnifying glass to an antlion sinkhole, kissing a boy and making him strip, falling into a fountain and getting 5 stitches, resulting in a fear of drowning, and another emergency room visit when her mother drank too much, followed by relief at almost a year of sobriety. Of all her answers, breakfast annoyed the psychologist most. She could see it in the corners of her mouth fighting a downward turn, the rigid stance, the coldness in her eyes. But she kept control. "Did you have a happy childhood?" "Normal." She thought of her mother pouring orange juice into her cereal instead of milk, her father's incessant nervous chatter, cheap motel vacations where her mother would cry at the end. "How close were you to your extended family?" "Close enough." She thought of birthday cards suitable for a 5-year-old even when she was 20. Visits every couple of years, a grandfather with long yellow fingernails and a bear's voice, a grandmother who lectured on religion and saving pennies. What were their names? "How do you feel about being part of a team?" "Just fine. I've often been part of teams." By which she meant off to the side. "You were let go from a number of field jobs. Do you want to tell me why?" She knew why, so she shrugged and said nothing. "Are you only agreeing to join this expedition because of your husband?" "How close were you and your husband? How often did you fight? Why did you fight? Why didn't you call the authorities the moment he returned to your house?" Those sessions clearly frustrated the psychologist on a professional level. Her training was predicated on drawing out personal information to establish trust and delve into deeper issues. But on another level, she seemed to approve of her answers. She'd once called her very self-contained, not as a pejorative. Only as they walked from the border toward base camp did it strike her that the very qualities the psychologist might disapprove of from a psychiatric perspective made her suitable for the expedition. Now the psychologist sat propped against a mound of sand, sheltered by the wall's shadow, in a broken pile, one leg straight out, the other trapped beneath her, alone. Her condition and the impact shape told her she'd jumped or been pushed from the lighthouse's top, probably not clearing the wall and being hurt on the way down. While she'd methodically spent hours going through journals, the psychologist had been lying here the whole time. She couldn't understand why she was still alive. Her jacket and shirt were covered in blood, but she was breathing, eyes open, looking toward the ocean as she knelt beside her. She had a gun in her outstretched left hand, which she gently took and tossed aside. The psychologist didn't seem to register her presence. When she touched her shoulder, she screamed, lunged away, falling over as she recoiled. She shrieked the word "Annihilation" over and over, the word becoming more meaningless, like the cry of a bird with a broken wing. She identified herself as the biologist, keeping her voice calm despite being rattled. The psychologist wheezed a chuckle, repeating "just you" as if it were a joke. As she propped her up, she heard a creaking groan, probably broken ribs. Her left arm and shoulder felt spongy under her jacket. Dark blood seeped around her stomach beneath the hand she'd pressed there. She could smell that she'd wet herself. The psychologist expressed surprise she was still there, as if she thought she'd killed her. She dismissed that. The psychologist asked for water, and she pressed her canteen to her mouth. Blood drops glistened on her chin. She asked where the surveyor was, back at base camp, and hadn't come with her. The wind revealed a slashing wound on the psychologist's forehead as she asked if the surveyor hadn't liked her company, or what she'd become. A chill came over her. She insisted she was the same. The psychologist's gaze drifted out to sea, and she said she'd seen her coming down the trail. That's how she knew she'd changed. Pressed for details, she coughed red spittle and described her as a flame scorching her gaze, a will-o'-the-wisp drifting across the salt flats and ruined village. Nothing human but something free and floating. She recognized the hypnotic tone and told her it wouldn't work. She was immune now. The psychologist's mouth opened and closed. Then she said she was always difficult, with an odd sense of pride. She asked why she hadn't shot her as she approached, having looked so inhuman. The psychologist said her arm wouldn't let her pull the trigger. That sounded delusional. She asked about her fall, pushed, accident, or intentional. The psychologist frowned, perplexity in her wrinkles, as if memory came in fragments. She'd thought something was after her, tried to shoot her and couldn't, then saw something coming from the stairs, felt overwhelming fear, and jumped. She insisted she jumped. When asked what it looked like, she said she never saw it. It was never there, or she saw it too many times. It was inside her. Inside her. She was trying to get away from what was inside her. She didn't believe any of it, interpreting the frenzy as a need for control. She tried another approach. Why had she taken the anthropologist down into the tunnel in the middle of the night? The psychologist hesitated, then said it was a miscalculation, impatience. She needed intel before risking the whole mission. When she mentioned the crawler's progress, she smiled wickedly at the name. She demanded to know what happened. The psychologist said it all went wrong. The anthropologist got too close. The thing reacted, killed her, wounded her. Yes, that's why she looked so shaken the next morning, and because she could tell she was already changing. She shouted she wasn't changing. The psychologist mocked her with a wet chuckle, saying she was just becoming more of what she'd always been. She demanded why she'd abandoned them. The expedition had been compromised, the psychologist said. She pushed for a real explanation. The psychologist asked if she'd ever given her one. They hadn't been compromised enough to abandon the mission, she insisted. One person dead, two changing, the fourth wavering. She called it a disaster. She accused her of helping create it, of panicking and giving up. The psychologist nodded, admitting that too. She should have recognized she'd changed, should have sent her back, shouldn't have gone down with the anthropologist. But here they were. She ignored the jab. What did the border look like? That smile again, she'd tell her when she got there. What really happened when they crossed over? Not what she'd expect. She felt lost again. The psychologist asked if she wanted the veil removed so she could access her own memories of crossing. She threatened to kill her if she tried anything. The thought of hypnosis and conditioning had been an invasive price. The psychologist asked how many of her memories were implanted, how many were verifiable. That wouldn't work on her, she said. She was sure of the here and now and her past. That was Ghostbird's castle keep, inviolate, punctured by hypnosis, but not breached. She sat back, wanting to leave before she was poisoned, but couldn't. She told her to stick to her hallucinations and describe the crawler. Some things she had to see with her own eyes, the psychologist said. She might get closer, be more familiar to it. What had she hidden about Area X? Too general. What did the black boxes measure? Nothing, just a psychological ploy to keep the expedition calm. The secret behind the tower? If they knew, would they keep sending expeditions? She said they were scared, the Southern Reach. That was her impression. Then they had no answers. She'd give her this scrap. The border was advancing slowly, a little more every year, in ways she wouldn't expect. But maybe soon it'd eat a mile or two at a time. The thought silenced her. Too close to the mystery's center, there was no way to pull back and see it whole. The black boxes might do nothing, but in her mind they were all blinking red. How many expeditions? The psychologist noted the journals, quite a lot. That didn't answer the question. Maybe she didn't know, or didn't want to tell her. What did the first expedition really find? The psychologist grimaced, not from pain, but as if remembering something shameful. There was video from that expedition, of a sort. The main reason no advanced tech was allowed after that. Video. After the mound of journals, that didn't startle her. What orders hadn't she revealed? She was beginning to bore her, the psychologist said, beginning to fade. Sometimes they told them more, sometimes less. They had their metrics and reasons. The they sounded hollow. Reluctantly, she returned to the personal. What did she know about her husband? Nothing more than she'd find from reading his journal. She lied, saying she hadn't found it yet. Very insightful about you, especially. Was that a bluff? She'd certainly had enough time in the lighthouse to find his journal, read it, and toss it back onto the pile. It didn't matter. The sky was darkening, the waves deepening, shorebirds scattering and regrouping as the surf receded. The sand seemed more porous around them, the meandering paths of crabs and worms still being written into its surface. A whole community lived here, oblivious to their conversation, and where out there lay the seaward border. When she'd asked during training, the psychologist had only said no one had ever crossed it, and she'd imagined expeditions evaporating into mist and light and distance. A rattle had entered the psychologist's breathing, now shallow and inconsistent. She relented, asking if there was anything she could do to make her more comfortable. The psychologist told her to leave her there when she died, not to bury her or take her anywhere. Leave her where she belonged. Was there anything else she'd tell her? The psychologist said they should never have come, that she should never have come, raw anguish beyond her physical condition. That was all? She'd come to believe it was the one fundamental truth. She took her to mean it was better to let the border advance, ignore it, let it affect a more distant generation. She didn't agree, but said nothing. Later, she'd believe she'd meant something altogether different. She asked if anyone had ever really come back from Area X. Not for a long time now, the psychologist whispered, tired. Not really, but she didn't know if she'd heard the question. Her head sagged, she lost consciousness, then came to again, staring at the waves. She muttered words that might have been remote or demote, hatching or watching. She couldn't be sure. Soon dusk would descend. She gave her more water. It was hard to think of her as an adversary as she neared death, even though she knew so much more than she'd told. She wasn't going to divulge anything else. Maybe she had looked to her like a flame. Maybe that was the only way she could think of her now. She asked if she'd known about the pile of journals before they came, but she didn't answer. There were things she had to do after she died, though she was running short of daylight and didn't like doing them. If she wouldn't answer questions alive, she'd have to answer some of them now. She took off the psychologist's jacket, discovering her own journal hidden in a zippered inside pocket. She put it aside under a stone. Then she cut away the left sleeve of her shirt with her penknife. The sponginess of her shoulder had bothered her, and she'd had good reason to be concerned. From collarbone to elbow, her arm had been colonized by fibrous green-gold fuzziness, giving off a faint glow. From indentations and a long rift down her triceps, it appeared to have spread from an initial wound, the wound from the crawler. Whatever had contaminated her, this different and more direct contact had spread faster, with more disastrous consequences. Certain parasites in fruiting bodies could cause paranoia, schizophrenia, realistic hallucinations, and delusional behavior. She had no doubt now she'd seen her as a flame, attributed her inability to shoot to an exterior force, been assailed by fear. The encounter with the crawler would have unhinged her. She cut skin and flesh samples from both arms, storing them in vials. She was shaking, so she took a break, turning to the journal. It was devoted to transcribing the tower's wall words, filled with new passages about revelation and reveling, strangling fruit and seeds of the dead, forgiving all sin. Margin notes read Lighthouse Keeper, North, and Island. She had no clue what they meant, or what it said about the psychologist's state of mind that her journal was devoted to this text. She felt only simple relief that someone had completed a task that would have been laborious otherwise. Her only question was whether she'd gotten the text from the tower walls, journals within the lighthouse, or some other source entirely. She still doesn't know. Carefully avoiding her shoulder and arm, she searched the psychologist's body, patting down her shirt and pants. She found a tiny handgun strapped to her left calf and a letter in a small envelope folded into her right boot. The psychologist had written a name on the envelope, starting with an S, her handwriting at least. Was it her child's name? A friend? A lover? She hadn't seen a name spoken or heard one in months, and seeing one bothered her deeply. It seemed wrong, as if it didn't belong in Area X. A name was a dangerous luxury here. Sacrifices didn't need names. The name was further confusion, a dark space growing in her mind. She tossed the gun far across the sand, balled up the envelope, and sent it after. She was thinking of discovering her husband's journal, how in some ways that discovery was worse than its absence, and she was still angry at the psychologist. She searched her pants pockets, finding change, a smooth worry stone, and a slip of paper. It listed hypnotic suggestions, induce paralysis, induce acceptance, compel obedience, each with activation words. The psychologist must have been intensely afraid of forgetting which words gave her control. The cheat sheet included reminders. Surveyor needs reinforcement. Anthropologist's mind is porous. About her, only the cryptic phrase, silence creates its own violence. The word annihilation was followed by help induce immediate suicide. They'd all been given self-destruct buttons, but the only one who could push them was dead. Part of her husband's life had been defined by childhood nightmares involving a house, a basement, and awful crimes. A psychiatrist had ruled out suppressed memory. He'd kept a diary to draw the poison. As an adult at university, months before joining the Navy, he'd gone to a classic film festival and seen his nightmares acted out. He realized the television must have been left on when he was a child, with that horror movie playing. The splinter in his mind disintegrated. He knew he was free, leaving behind childhood shadows. It had all been an illusion. He'd confessed to her the night he said he'd joined the 11th expedition. He'd had a new kind of dream, not a nightmare. He floated over pristine wilderness, the feeling of freedom indescribable, as if everything from his nightmares had been reversed. The dreams varied, sometimes swimming through marsh canals, sometimes becoming a tree or a drop of water. Everything refreshed him, made him want to go to Area X. He'd already met with recruiters, talked for hours, knew it was the right decision. Not everyone was taken. Some were rejected, others lost the thread. She'd pointed out that others must have wondered what they'd done when it was too late. All she understood of Area X came from vague official stories and rumors. Danger didn't cross her mind so much as the idea he'd just told her he wanted to leave her and withheld the information for weeks. She wasn't privy to hypnosis or reconditioning, so it didn't occur that he might have been made suggestible. Her response was profound silence as he searched her face. He turned away, sat on the couch. She poured a very large glass of wine and took the opposite chair. They stayed that way a long time. He started talking again about Area X, his work needing more challenge. But she wasn't really listening, thinking about her mundane job, the wilderness, wondering why she hadn't done something similar. In that moment, she couldn't blame him. Didn't she sometimes go off on field trips? She might not be gone for months, but in principle it was the same. The arguing came later, when it became real. But never pleading. She never begged him to stay. Perhaps he thought going away would save their marriage. Some things she'll never be good at. Standing beside the psychologist's body, looking out to sea, she knew her husband's journal waited, that soon she'd know what nightmare he'd encountered, and she knew she still blamed him fiercely, yet somewhere in her heart she'd begun to believe there was no place she'd rather be than in Area X. She'd lingered too long and would have to travel through the dark to make it back to base camp. If she kept a steady pace, she might make it by midnight. Arriving at an unexpected hour had advantage, given how she'd left things with the surveyor. Something warned against staying at the lighthouse overnight. The unease from the psychologist's wound or the sense of a presence. She set out soon after gathering her knapsack and her husband's journal. Behind her lay the solemn silhouette of what was no longer a lighthouse, but a reliquary. Staring back, she saw a thin green fountain of light gushing up, framed by the dunes, and felt more resolved to put miles between them. It was the psychologist's wound, glowing brighter than before, some sped-up form of life burning fiercely. Another phrase from her journal came to mind. A fire that knows your name, its dark flame acquiring every part of you. Within the hour, the lighthouse disappeared into the night, and with it the beacon the psychologist had become. The wind picked up, the darkness intensified. The distant sound of waves had become like eavesdropping on a sinister whispering conversation. She walked as quietly as possible through the ruined village under just a sliver of moon, unwilling to risk her flashlight. The shapes in the exposed rooms had gathered a darkness that stood out against the night, and in their utter stillness, she sensed an unnerving suggestion of movement. She was glad to soon be past them and onto the trail where reeds choked both the canal and the little lakes. Ahead lay the black water and cypress trees, vanguard for the pines. A few minutes later, the moaning started. For a moment she thought it was in her head, then stopped abruptly to listen. Whatever they'd heard every night at dusk was at it again. In her eagerness to leave the lighthouse, she'd forgotten it lived in the reeds. This close, the sound was more guttural, filled with confused anguish and rage, so utterly human and inhuman that for the second time since entering Area X, she considered the supernatural. It came from ahead and the landward side, through thick reeds. It seemed unlikely she could pass without it hearing her. What then? She decided to forge ahead, taking out the smaller of her flashlights and crouching as she turned it on so the beam couldn't be seen above the reeds. In this awkward way, she walked forward, gun drawn, alert to the sound's direction. Soon she could hear it closer, pushing through the reeds, still distant but approaching. A few minutes passed with good progress. Then something nudged against her boot and flopped over. She aimed her flashlight at the ground and leapt back, gasping. A human face seemed to be rising from the earth. But when nothing further happened, she shone the light again and saw it was a tan mask made of skin, half transparent, like a discarded horseshoe crab shell. A wide face with pockmarks across the left cheek, blank, sightless eyes staring. She felt she should recognize these features, but disembodied like this, she couldn't. The sight restored some calm. A discarded exoskeleton, even one resembling a human face, represented a solvable mystery, one that pushed back the disturbing image of an expanding border and countless lies. Bending at the knees, she shone her flashlight ahead and saw more detritus, a long trail of skin-like debris, husks, and sloughings. She might soon meet what had shed this material, and clearly the moaning creature was, or had once been, human. She recalled the village, the dolphin's strange eyes. A question existed there she might answer in too personal a way. But the most important question was whether just after molting the thing became sluggish or more active. It depended on the species, and she wasn't an expert on this one. She had little stamina for a new encounter, though it was too late to retreat. Continuing, she came to a place where reeds had been flattened into a 3-foot-wide path. The moltings veered off too. Shining the flashlight, she saw the path curved sharply right after less than 100 feet. The creature was already ahead of her, out in the reeds, and could circle back to block her return. Dragging sounds intensified, almost equal to the moaning. A thick musk clung to the air. She had no desire to return to the lighthouse, so she picked up her pace. Darkness was so complete she could only see a few feet ahead. She felt like she was moving through an encircling tunnel. The moaning grew louder, but directionless. The smell became a special stench. The ground sagged under her weight. Water must be close. The moaning came again, as close as she'd ever heard it, now mixed with loud thrashing. She stopped and stood on tiptoe to shine her flashlight over the reeds, seeing a great disrupting wave of motion ahead at a right angle, closing fast, reeds falling as if machine threshed. The thing was trying to outflank her, and the brightness surged to cover her panic. She hesitated, some part wanting to see the creature after hearing it for days. Was it the remnants of the scientists trying to regroup, applying logic when only survival mattered? A very small part. She ran. It surprised her how fast she could go, down the tunnel of blackness lined with reeds, raked by them and not caring, willing the brightness to propel her forward, to get past the beast before it cut her off. She could feel the thudding vibration of its passage, the rasping clack of reeds, the expectant tone of its moaning sickening her with the urgency of its seeking. From the darkness came an impression of great weight aimed from her left, a suggestion of a tortured pale visage and ponderous bulk behind it. Barreling toward a point ahead, she had no choice but to let it keep coming, lunging forward like a sprinter at the finish line to be past and free. It was coming too fast. She wasn't going to make it, not at that angle, but she was committed. The crucial moment came. She thought she felt its hot breath on her side, flinched and cried out. Then the way was clear, and from almost right behind came a high keening, the feeling of the air suddenly filled, the sound of something massive trying to break and change direction, pulled into the reeds on the opposite side by its own momentum. An almost plaintive keening called out to her, pleading for her to return, to see it entire, to acknowledge its existence. She didn't look back. She kept running. Gasping, she stopped and walked on rubbery legs until the trail opened into forest. She found a large oak and spent the night wedged uncomfortably in its crook. She could still hear the creature, though far distant. She didn't want to think about it, but couldn't stop. She drifted in and out of sleep, one eye on the ground. Once, something large and snuffling paused at the base of the tree, then moved on. Another time, vague shapes moved in the middle distance, luminous eyes floating in the dark, but she sensed no threat. She held her husband's journal to her chest like a talisman, still refusing to open it. Her fears about its contents had only grown. Sometime before morning, she woke to find her brightness had become literal. Her skin gave off faint phosphorescence. She tried to hide her hands in her sleeves, draw her collar up to be less visible, then drifted off again. Part of her just wanted to sleep forever. She remembered where she'd seen the molted mask before, the psychologist from the 11th expedition, a man she'd seen interviewed after his return. He'd said in a calm tone that Area X was quite beautiful and peaceful, that they'd seen nothing unusual, and smiled vaguely. Death, she was beginning to understand, was not the same here as back across the border. The next morning, her head still full of the creature's moans, she re-entered the part of Area X where the trail rose to a steep incline, swampy black water on either side littered with deceptively dead-seeming cypress knees. The water stole all sound, its unmoving surface reflecting only gray moss and tree limbs. She loved this part of the trail as no other. The world had a watchfulness matched only by peaceful solitude. Base camp was a mile away. She was lazy with the light and the hum of insects, rehearsing what to tell the surveyor and what to withhold. The brightness flared. She had time to take a half-step right. The first shot hit her left shoulder instead of the heart, twisting her back. The second ripped through her left side, spinning her and tripping her down the hill. She hit the bottom, breath knocked out, one hand plunged into black water, the other trapped beneath her. The pain in her side was like being opened and sewn back together with a butcher knife. But it quickly subsided to a roiling ache, the wounds reduced to a sensation of tiny animals squirming inside her. Only seconds had passed. She had to move. Her gun was still holstered. She took it out. She'd seen the scope in the tall grass, recognized the ambusher. The surveyor was ex-military and good, but she couldn't know the brightness had protected her, that shock wasn't overtaking her, that the wound hadn't paralyzed her. She rolled onto her belly, intending to crawl along the water's edge. The surveyor's voice called out, demanding where the psychologist was and what she'd done with her. She made the mistake of telling the truth. She was dead. The surveyor fired a round over her head. She shouted that she hadn't killed her, that she jumped. The surveyor threw the hypnotic phrase back at her like a grenade, but it had no effect. She pleaded that she was hurt badly, that she wasn't her enemy. Pathetic, placating words. No reply, just bees buzzing, water gurgling. She looked up at the stunning blue sky. She tried again, telling the surveyor to go back to camp, take supplies, return to the border. She wouldn't stop her. The surveyor responded, voice closer, that she didn't believe any of it, that she'd come back not human anymore and should kill herself so she didn't have to. She insisted she was as human as she was, that this was a natural thing, realizing she wouldn't understand. She wanted to say she was a natural thing too, but didn't know the truth. The surveyor screamed for her name. She shouted back that it wouldn't make a difference. She didn't understand why it made a difference. Silence was her answer. She was a demon, something she couldn't understand or had chosen not to. She could feel her coming closer, crouching for cover. The surveyor would not risk another shot until she had a clear bead on her target. The biologist felt the raw urge to simply charge up the slope, firing wildly, but she suppressed it. Instead, she moved low and fast along the water's edge, half crawling, half creeping toward the other woman's position. She knew the surveyor would expect her to flee, to put distance between them, but with the range of that rifle, retreat was a death sentence. She forced her breathing to slow, straining her ears for any sound that might betray the surveyor's location. A faint footfall reached her from the opposite side of the hill. The biologist spotted a clump of mud, scooped it up, and hurled it in a low arc down the length of the black water, back toward where she had come from. It landed with a wet, heavy plop some 50 feet away. In that same instant, she was already edging up the hillside, raising her head just enough to glimpse the edge of the trail. The top of the surveyor's head appeared not 10 feet ahead, rising from where she had dropped to crawl through the tall grass. It was a flash, less than a second of exposure before the surveyor would be gone again. The biologist did not pause to think, did not allow herself a moment's hesitation. She fired. The surveyor's head snapped to the side. She slumped into the grass without a cry, rolling onto her back with a low groan like someone disturbed mid-sleep. And then she was still. Blood spread across the side of her face, her forehead a grotesque, misshapen ruin. The biologist slid back down the incline, staring at the gun in her hand, shock settling over her like a cold weight. She felt caught between two futures, though she had already cast her lot with one. Now there was only her. Cautiously, she crept back up, keeping low against the hill. The surveyor's body lay exactly where it had fallen, unmoving. She had never killed anyone before. And in this place, with its strange rules, she could not even be certain that death was permanent, a thought she clung to, trying to steady her shaking hands. Beneath that fragile comfort, a darker current ran. She could have tried longer to reason with the other woman. She could have slipped away into the wilderness instead of taking the shot. She forced herself upright and walked to the top of the hill, a dull ache radiating from her shoulder wound but nothing worse. Standing over the body, with the rifle lying straight above the surveyor's bloody head like an exclamation mark, She found herself wondering about the woman's last hours at base camp. What doubts had tormented her? Had she started for the border, turned back, set out again, trapped in a loop of indecision? Something must have finally pushed her to this confrontation, or maybe the solitude of that place, pressing down on a person alone with their thoughts, had been enough. If she had returned when she said she would, might it have been different? She could not leave the surveyor there, but she hesitated at the thought of carrying her back to base camp, of burying her in the old graveyard. The brightness within her made her uncertain. What if the body had a purpose here? What if burying it would prevent some transformation that might otherwise occur? In the end, she rolled the surveyor over and over toward the water, feeling the skin still warm and elastic beneath her hands, blood still seeping from the head wound. At the water's edge, she spoke a few words, a hope for forgiveness, a stated intention to forgive in return. The words sounded hollow and absurd even as she said them, and she knew that if the surveyor were suddenly resurrected, they would likely both admit they forgave nothing. She waded into the black water, the body heavy in her arms. At knee depth, she let go and watched it sink. She stood there until the pale, outstretched shape of the left hand vanished from sight, then waded back to shore. She did not know what the surveyor believed about an afterlife, whether she expected resurrection in heaven or simply to become food for the worms. But above her, the cypress trees formed a kind of cathedral arching over the dark water as the body descended. She had no time to absorb what she had done. The moment she stood on the trail again, the brightness surged through her, seizing far more than just her nerve centers. She crumpled, wrapped in a sensation like an encroaching winter of dark ice, the brightness spreading into a blazing corona of brilliant blue light with a white-hot core. She felt cigarette burns across her skin as a searing snow drifted down, infiltrating her flesh. Soon she was frozen, utterly numb, trapped inside her own body on the trail, her eyes fixed on the thick blades of grass in front of her, her mouth half open against the dirt. There should have been a comfort in being spared the pain of her wounds, but instead she was haunted in her delirium. She could recall only 3 moments from that ordeal. First, the surveyor, psychologist, and anthropologist peering down at her through ripples, as if she were a tadpole staring up from the bottom of a pool, their faces lingering far too long. Second, herself sitting beside the moaning creature, her hand resting on its head, murmuring something in a language she did not recognize. Third, a vision of the border drawn as a vast circular moat around Area X, filled with immense sea creatures swimming in oblivious silence, and the absence of their regard felt like a terrible bereavement. Later, from the thrash marks in the grass, she would realize she had not been frozen at all. She had been spasming and twitching in the dirt like a worm, a distant part of her still experiencing the agony, trying to die, but the brightness would not let her. If she could have reached her gun, she would have shot herself in the head and been glad of it. She had withheld certain details about the brightness, hoping to preserve her objectivity in the eyes of any reader. But the truth was this. In the moments before the surveyor opened fire, the brightness had expanded within her, heightening her senses to an extreme degree. She had felt the subtle shift of the surveyor's hips as she settled into position, heard the beads of sweat trickling down her forehead, smelled the deodorant she wore, even tasted the yellowing grass flattened beneath her. When she fired, it was with those enhanced senses still engaged, the only reason she had been able to land the shot at all. This was an extreme version of what she had already been experiencing. On her journey to the lighthouse and back, the brightness had manifested as a low-grade cold, a mild fever, cough, sinus difficulties, spells of faintness and lightheadedness. A floating sensation would alternate with a dragging heaviness, never in balance, leaving her either buoyant or leaden. She thought of her husband, who would have tried everything to cure this, to erase the scars, and she was grateful he was not here. He would have wasted his energy on a fight that could not be won. She had learned long ago that some things you simply endure, focusing only on what remains to you. When she finally came to her senses, it was noon of the next day. Somehow she had dragged herself back to base camp. She was hollowed out, her body screaming for water. She gulped down nearly a gallon over the next hours just to feel whole again. Her side burned, but she could sense that a rapid, unnatural repair was underway, enough to let her move. The brightness, which had already infiltrated her limbs, seemed to have fought itself to a draw with her body, its progress stunted by the need to heal her injuries. The cold symptoms had faded. The alternating lightness and heaviness had been replaced by a constant hum within her, along with an unsettling sensation of something creeping just beneath her skin, forming a perfect mimic of the visible layer. She knew better than to trust this feeling of well-being. It was only a pause before the next stage. The changes thus far, enhanced senses, faster reflexes, a phosphorescent tint to her skin, seemed mild, but she had learned a grim lesson. To keep the brightness in check, she would need to keep getting hurt, to keep shocking her system. When she saw the state of base camp, her reaction was almost mundane. The surveyor had hacked the tents to shreds. The remaining scientific records from prior expeditions had been burned. Blackened fragments still stuck out from the ash-crumbling logs. Any weapons the surveyor couldn't carry, she had disassembled and scattered across the camp as a challenge. Emptied food cans lay everywhere. In her absence, the surveyor had turned into a kind of frenzied destroyer. The surveyor's journal sat on the remains of her cot, surrounded by yellowing maps. It was blank. The times the biologist had seen her writing in it had been a deception. The surveyor had never intended to share her true thoughts with any of them. The biologist found she respected that. But the surveyor had left one final message on a scrap of paper by the bed, which offered a bleak clue to her hostility. She claimed the anthropologist had tried to return and she had dealt with it. The biologist didn't know if that was madness or cold sanity. She sorted through the maps. They were not of Area X, but of places the surveyor had once lived, covered in personal annotations. She couldn't fault the other woman for trying to anchor herself in memory, however futile that quest. Taking stock, she found a few overlooked cans of food, some hidden water she had stashed in her sleeping bag. Her samples were gone, likely flung into the swamp, but she still had her measurement notes in a small notebook. She would miss her larger microscope, but the portable one would suffice. She had enough food for a couple of weeks, water for several more days, and could always boil more. She had matches enough for a month, and the skills to start a fire without them. More supplies awaited at the lighthouse, in the psychologist's knapsack. Behind the camp, she found what the surveyor had added to the old graveyard, a freshly dug, empty grave with a mound of dirt beside it, a simple cross of fallen branches stabbed into the ground. She wondered if the grave had been meant for her, or for the anthropologist, or both. The thought of lying beside the anthropologist for eternity unsettled her. Later, while cleaning up, a fit of laughter seized her, doubling her over in pain. It was the sudden memory of doing the dishes the night her husband had returned from across the border, wiping scraps of spaghetti and chicken from a plate, and wondering with a strange bewilderment how such a mundane act could coexist with the impossible mystery of his reappearance. She had never thrived in cities, though she had lived in one by necessity, because her husband needed to be there, because the best jobs for her were there, because she had sabotaged herself when field opportunities arose. But she was not a domesticated animal. The grit and grime of urban life, its relentless wakefulness, the crowding, the ever-present light that blotted out the stars, the constant fumes of gasoline, the countless ways it whispered of their collective destruction, none of it appealed to her. Months before her husband departed with the 11th expedition, he had begun asking where she went so late at night. There was an unspoken insistence beneath the question, a really she could hear clearly. She gave him a flat denial, claiming she went nowhere, even as she meant everywhere. When he pressed further, she countered with a blunt assurance that she was not being unfaithful. The directness usually silenced him, even if it failed to reassure. She had told him the late-night walks relaxed her, helped her sleep when work became too much. But the truth was simpler. She only walked as far as an empty lot, overgrown with grass. It appealed to her because it was not truly empty. 2 species of snails and 3 of lizards called it home, along with butterflies and dragonflies. A puddle had formed in a muddy truck rut, over time collecting rainwater until it became a pond. Fish eggs had somehow found their way there, and minnows and tadpoles and aquatic insects thrived. Weeds grew up around it, holding the soil in place. Migrating songbirds used it as a refueling station. As habitats went, it was not complex, but its proximity dulled the impulse to simply drive toward the nearest wild place. She liked visiting late at night for the chance to spot a wary fox passing through, or a sugar glider resting on a telephone pole. Nighthawks gathered to feast on the insects swarming the street lamps. Mice and owls enacted their ancient rituals of predator and prey. They all carried a watchfulness different from that of true wilderness, a jaded watchfulness, born of a long and weary history of bad faith encounters with humans. She never told her husband the walk had a destination. She wanted to keep that patch of urban wilderness for herself. There were so many rituals couples performed out of habit and expectation, and she did not mind them. Sometimes she even enjoyed them. But she needed to be selfish about that lot. It expanded in her mind while she worked, calmed her, gave her miniature dramas to anticipate. She did not know that while she applied this bandage to her need for open space, her husband was dreaming of Area X and far greater expanses. Later, the parallel would help soften her anger at his leaving, and then her confusion at his changed return, even if she still could not truly grasp what she had missed about him. The psychologist had claimed the border was advancing a little more each year, but the biologist found that statement too limiting, too ignorant. There were thousands of dead spaces like her lot, thousands of transitional environments invisible because they were deemed useless. Anything could inhabit them without notice. They had come to think of the border as a monolithic wall, but if the 11th expedition could return unnoticed, could not other things have already slipped through? In this new phase of her brightness, recovering from her wounds, the tower called to her incessantly. She could feel its physical presence beneath the earth with a clarity akin to the first flush of attraction, when you know without looking exactly where the object of desire stands. Part of it was her own need to return, but part might be the spore's effect. She fought the pull because there was work to do first, work that might, if left undisturbed, put everything into perspective. She had to quarantine the lies of her superiors from data that pertained to Area X's actual eccentricities. The secret knowledge of a proto-Area X, a preamble and beachhead established first, was one such truth. The mound of journals had radically altered her view, but the higher number of expeditions told her little more about the tower and its effects. It told her primarily that even if the border was expanding, the assimilation remained conservative. The journal's recurring data on cycles and seasonal fluctuations were useful for establishing trends, but her superiors likely already knew this. The myth that only a few early expeditions had come to grief reinforced the idea of cycles within an overall framework of advance. The journal's individual details might tell stories of heroism or cowardice, good decisions and bad, but ultimately they spoke to inevitability. No one had yet plumbed intent or purpose in a way that obstructed them. Everyone had died or been killed, returned, changed, or unchanged. But Area X continued as it always had. Their superiors seemed so afraid of radical reimagining that they kept sending in ill-prepared expeditions as if it were the only option. Feed Area X, but do not antagonize it, and perhaps someone would, through luck or repetition, stumble upon an explanation before the world became Area X. She could not corroborate any of this, but she took a grim comfort in the theories. She left her husband's journal for last, though its pull was as strong as the tower's. Instead, she focused on the samples she had brought back, from the ruined village, from the psychologist, and from her own skin. She set up her microscope on the rickety table. The cells from the psychologist, both from her unaffected shoulder and her wound, appeared normal. So did her own. This was impossible. She checked them over and over, even childishly pretending disinterest before swooping in with an eagle eye. She became convinced that when she was not looking, these cells became something else, that observation itself changed everything. She knew it was madness, yet she could not shake it. Area X seemed to laugh at her then. Every blade of grass, every stray insect, every drop of water. What would happen when the crawler reached the bottom of the tower? What would happen when it came back up? Then she examined the village samples: moss from the forehead of one of the eruptions, splinters of wood, a dead fox, a rat. The wood was wood. The rat was a rat. But the moss and the fox were composed of modified human cells. She should have recoiled from the microscope, but she was beyond such reactions. She settled for quiet cursing. The boar on the way to base camp, the strange dolphins, the tormented beast in the reeds, even the replicas of the 11th expedition, all supported the microscope's evidence. Transformations were taking place, and as much as she had felt part of a natural landscape on her trek to the lighthouse, she could not deny these habitats were transitional in a deeply unnatural way. A perverse relief overtook her. At least now she had proof of strangeness, along with the brain tissue the anthropologist had taken from the crawler's skin. She had had enough of samples. She ate lunch and decided against more cleaning. That task would fall to the next expedition. It was another brilliant afternoon of blue sky and comfortable heat. She sat for a time, watching dragonflies skim the long grass, a red-headed woodpecker's dipping, looping flight. She was putting off the inevitable return to the tower, wasting time. When she finally picked up her husband's journal and began to read, the brightness washed over her in waves, connecting her to the earth, the water, the trees, the air, as she opened up and kept on opening. Nothing about the journal was expected, except for some terse, hastily scribbled exceptions. He had addressed most entries to her. She did not want this, and as soon as she realized it, she had to resist the urge to throw the journal away like poison. It was not about love or its lack, but guilt. He had meant to share this with her, and now he was either truly dead or existed in a state beyond any possible communication, any reciprocation. The 11th expedition had 8 members, all male: a psychologist, 2 medics including him, a linguist, a surveyor, a biologist, an anthropologist, and an archaeologist. They had arrived in winter, when trees were bare and reeds dark and thick. The flowering bushes seemed sullen, huddling along the path. Birds were fewer than reports suggested, he noted, wondering where they went. Only the ghost bird knew. The sky often clouded, the cypress swamps low. There had been no rain the entire first week. They, too, discovered what only she called the tower on their 5th or 6th day. She was more and more certain the base camp had been chosen to trigger that discovery. But their surveyor insisted on mapping the wider area first, so they followed a different course. None of them were eager to climb down, he wrote, and he least of all. He had claustrophobia, sometimes leaving their bed to sleep on the deck. The psychologist had not coerced them into the tower. They explored past the ruined village to the lighthouse and beyond. He noted their horror at the signs of carnage, but their respect for the dead, leaving the overturned tables as they were. He did not mention the photograph on the landing wall, which disappointed her. Like her, they discovered the journal pile at the top of the lighthouse and were shaken. They argued intensely. He wanted to abort and return home, clearly having been lied to. But the psychologist re-established control, if tenuous. The directive was for the expedition to remain a unit, yet in the next entry they had decided to split up, as if salvaging the mission by catering to each person's will, ensuring no one would try to return. The other medic, the anthropologist, the archaeologist, and the psychologist stayed at the lighthouse to read the journals and investigate the area. The linguist and the biologist went back to explore the tower. Her husband and the surveyor continued past the lighthouse. In a manic entry he wrote that she would love it here, the light on the dunes, the sheer expansive wildness of it. The euphoria unsettled her more than optimism would have. For a full week, they traveled up the coast, mapping as they went, always expecting to encounter the border, some obstacle that would bar their progress. But they never did. The same habitat confronted them day after day. He believed they were heading north, yet despite covering 15 to 20 miles by nightfall, nothing changed. It was all the same, though he insisted they were not caught in a strange recurring loop. Still, he knew they should have reached the border by now. They were deep into an expanse he called the Southern Reach that had not been charted, an area their superiors had encouraged them to assume existed back beyond the border. She had also known Area X ended abruptly not far past the lighthouse, but she had known this only because their superiors had told them during training, which meant, in fact, she knew nothing at all. They finally turned back because behind them they saw strange cascading lights far in the distance, and from the interior more lights and sounds they could not identify. Concern for the expedition members left behind drove them. At the point of turning, they had come within sight of a rocky island, the first they had seen, and felt a powerful urge to explore it, though there was no easy way to reach it. The island appeared to have been inhabited at one time, with stone houses dotting a hill and a dock below. The return trip to the lighthouse took 4 days, not 7, as if the land had contracted. At the lighthouse they found the psychologist gone, and the bloody aftermath of a shootout on the landing halfway up. A dying survivor, the archaeologist, told them something not of the world had come up the stairs, killed the psychologist, and withdrawn with his body. But the psychologist came back later, the archaeologist raved. There were only 2 bodies, and neither was the psychologist. He could not account for the absence, nor explain why they had shot each other, only repeating that they did not trust themselves. Her husband noted that some wounds were not from bullets, and the blood spatter did not match any crime scene he knew. A strange residue covered the floor. The archaeologist propped himself up in the corner of the landing and threatened to shoot if anyone came close enough to treat his wounds. Soon enough, he was dead. Afterward, they dragged the bodies from the landing and buried them high on the beach, a little distance from the lighthouse. It was difficult, he wrote, and he did not know that they ever really recovered. This left the linguist and the biologist at the tower. The surveyor suggested either going back up the coast or following the beach down, but they both knew this was avoidance. What he was really saying was that they should abandon the mission, lose themselves in the landscape. That landscape was impinging on them now. The temperature dipped and rose violently. There were rumblings deep underground, slight tremors. The sun took on a greenish tinge, as if the border were distorting their vision. They saw flocks of birds headed inland, not of the same species, but hawks and ducks, herons and eagles all grouped together as if in common cause. At the tower, they ventured only a few levels down before coming back up. She noticed no mention of words on the wall. If the linguist and the biologist were inside, they were much farther down, and they had no interest in following. Returning to base camp, they found the body of the biologist, stabbed several times. The linguist had left a note saying simply that he had gone to the tunnel and not to look for him. She felt a strange pang of sympathy for the fallen biologist, imagining he had tried to reason with the linguist, or perhaps tried to kill him. But the linguist had clearly already been ensnared by the tower, by the words of the crawler. Knowing the meaning of those words on such intimate terms might have been too much for anyone. The surveyor and her husband returned to the tower at dusk. The journal entries became broken, with gaps of hours unrecorded. But during the night, they saw a ghastly procession heading into the tower. 7 of the 8 members of the 11th expedition, including a doppelganger of her husband and the surveyor. He watched himself walk stiffly, with a blank expression, clearly not him, yet unmistakably him. Shock froze both men. They did not try to stop them. It seemed impossible to try to stop themselves. They could only watch until the procession had descended. For a moment afterward, everything made sense. They were dead, ghosts roaming a haunted landscape, unable to see the normal lives being lived around them through the veil of interference. Slowly, her husband shook off that feeling. They waited hidden in the trees for hours to see if the doppelgangers would return. They argued about what to do if they did. The surveyor wanted to kill them. Her husband wanted to interrogate them. In their shock, neither made much of the psychologist's absence. At one point, a hissing sound like steam emanated from the tower, and a beam of light shot into the sky, then abruptly cut off. Still no one emerged, and eventually they returned to base camp. It was then they decided to go their separate ways. The surveyor had seen enough and planned to return to the border immediately. Her husband refused, suspecting from journal readings that returning through the same entry point might be a trap. Having encountered no obstacle traveling north, he had grown suspicious of the entire idea of borders, though he could not yet synthesize that feeling into a coherent theory. Interspersed with this account were personal observations. One passage struck her deeply. He wished she were there, wished they had volunteered together. He would have understood her better on the trek north. They would not have needed to speak if she did not want to. It would not have bothered him. And they would not have turned back. They would have kept going until they could go no farther. Slowly, painfully, she realized what she had been reading from the very first words. Her husband had an inner life beyond his gregarious exterior, and if she had known enough to let him inside her guard, she might have understood this. But she had not. She had let tidal pools and fungi inside her guard, but not him. Of all the journal's aspects, this ate at her most. He had created his share of their problems, pushing too hard, wanting too much, trying to see something in her that did not exist. But she could have met him partway and retained her sovereignty. Now it was too late. His personal observations included many grace notes, a margin drawing of a tidal pool, a lengthy observation of a skimmer using an oyster outcropping to kill a large fish. Photographs of the tidal pool were stuck in a sleeve, along with pressed wildflowers, a seed pod, unusual leaves. He would have cared little for any of this. The focus required would have been great. She knew these elements were intended for her alone. There were no endearments, and she understood in part because of that restraint. He knew how much she hated words like love. The last entry, written upon his return to the lighthouse, said he was going back up the coast, not on foot. There was a boat in the ruined village, staved in and rotting, but he had enough wood from the wall outside the lighthouse to fix it. He would follow the shoreline as far as he could go, to the island and perhaps beyond. If she ever read this, that was where he was going, where he would be. Could there be, even within all these transitional ecosystems, one still more transitional, at the limits of the tower's influence but not yet under the borders? After reading the journal, she was left with the comfort of that image. Her husband putting out to sea in a rebuilt boat, through crashing surf to the calm beyond, following the coastline north alone, seeking joy in small moments remembered from happier days. It made her fiercely proud of him. It showed resolve, bravery. It bound him to her more intimately than they had ever seemed while together. In glimmers, in shreds of thought afterward, she wondered if he kept a journal still, or if the dolphin's eye had been familiar for a reason beyond its human quality. But she banished the thought. Some questions will ruin you if denied the answer long enough. Her injuries had receded to a constant but manageable ache when she breathed. By nightfall, the brightness was threshing up through her lungs and throat again, and she imagined wisps of it misting from her mouth. She shuddered at the memory of the psychologist's distant plume, like a distress signal. She could not wait for morning. She would return to the tower now. It was the only place for her. She left behind the assault rifle and all but one gun, left her knife, left her knapsack, affixed a water canteen to her belt. She took her camera but abandoned it halfway to the tower. The impulse to record would only distract, and photographs mattered no more than samples. Decades of journals waited in the lighthouse. Generations of expeditions had ghosted on ahead. The pointlessness and pressure almost overwhelmed her again. The waste of it all. She had brought a flashlight, but found she could see well enough by the green glow emanating from her own body. She crept quickly through the dark along the path to the tower. The black, cloudless sky, framed by tall pines, reflected the full immensity of the heavens. No borders, no artificial light to obscure the thousands of glinting pinpricks. She could see everything. As a child, she had searched for shooting stars. As an adult, she looked for fixed ones, imagining what kind of life lived in those celestial tidal pools. The stars now looked strange, strewn across the dark in chaotic new patterns, where just the night before she had taken comfort in their familiarity. Was she only now seeing them clearly? Was she even farther from home than she had thought? There was a grim satisfaction in the thought. The heartbeat came more distantly as she entered the tower, her mask tied tightly over her nose and mouth. She did not know if she was keeping contamination out or just containing her brightness. The bioluminescence of the words had intensified, and the glow from her skin seemed to respond, lighting her way. She sensed no difference as she descended past the first levels. These upper reaches had become familiar, but that was balanced by the sobering fact that this was her first time alone. With each curve into further darkness, she came to expect something to erupt from the shadows. She missed the surveyor and had to tamp down her guilt. Despite her concentration, she found herself drawn to the words on the wall, even as she tried to focus on the greater depths. She reached the place where the anthropologist's body lay sooner than expected. It surprised her that the corpse remained there, still surrounded by the debris of its final passage. Scraps of cloth, an empty knapsack, a few broken vials, the head forming a broken outline against the stone. A moving carpet of pale organisms covered it, and when she stooped close, she recognized them as the tiny hand-shaped parasites that lived among the words on the wall. She could not tell if they were protecting the body, transforming it, or breaking it down, just as she could not know whether some version of the anthropologist had indeed appeared to the surveyor near base camp after she had left for the lighthouse. She did not linger. She continued downward. Now the tower's heartbeat echoed louder, and the words on the wall grew fresher, as if only just dried after creation. Beneath the heartbeat she became aware of a hum, a staticky buzzing. The brittle mustiness gave way to something more tropical and cloying. She found herself sweating. The track of the crawler beneath her boots had grown fresher, stickier, and she tried to favor the right-hand wall to avoid the substance. That wall had changed too, now covered in a thin layer of moss or lichen. She did not like pressing her back against it to avoid the floor's residue, but she had no choice. After about 2 hours of slowed progress, the heartbeat had risen to a point where it seemed to shake the stairs. The underlying hum splintered into a fresh crackling. Her ears rang, her body vibrated. Sweat soaked through her clothes from the humidity, and the stuffiness made her want to tear off her mask and gulp air. She resisted. She was close. To what? She had no idea. The words here were so freshly formed they appeared to drip, and the hand-shaped creatures were fewer. Those that remained formed closed fists as if not yet awake. That which dies shall still know life and death, for all that decays is not forgotten, and reanimated shall walk the world in a bliss of not knowing. She spiraled around one more set of stairs, and as she came into the narrow straightaway before the next curve, she saw light, the edges of a sharp golden light emanating from beyond the wall. The brightness within her throbbed and thrilled to it. The buzzing intensified until it was jagged and hissing, and she felt as if blood might trickle from her ears. The heartbeat boomed into every part of her. She no longer felt like a person, but simply a receiving station for overwhelming transmissions. She felt the brightness spewing from her mouth in a half-invisible spray, meeting the mask's resistance, and she tore it off with a gasp. "Give back to that which gave to you," came the thought. She did not know what she was feeding, or what it meant for the collection of cells and thoughts that comprised her. She could no more have turned back than gone back in time. Her free will was compromised if only by the severe temptation of the unknown. To quit that place without rounding that corner, her imagination would have tormented her forever. She had convinced herself she would rather die knowing something, anything. She passed the threshold. She descended into the light. One night during her last months at Rock Bay, after confirming her grant would not be renewed and before any new job prospects, she found herself intensely restless. She had brought a stranger back from the bar to distract herself, but he had left hours ago. She was still drunk, wakeful, and could not shake it. Stupid and dangerous as it was, she decided to drive out to the tidal pools. She wanted to creep up on that hidden life, surprise it somehow. She had gotten it into her head that the tidal pools changed at night when no one watched. Perhaps what happens when you study something so long you can identify every denizen instantly. She parked, took the winding trail down to the grainy beach with only a tiny keychain flashlight, sloshed through shallows, and climbed onto the sheet of rock. She wanted to lose herself. People had always told her she was too much in control, but that had never been true. She had never truly been in control, had never wanted control. That night, even with 1,000 excuses to blame others, she knew she had screwed up. Not filing reports, not sticking to the job's focus, recording odd peripheral data. Nothing that would satisfy the grant organization. She was queen of the title pools, and what she said was law, and what she reported was what she had wanted to report. She had gotten sidetracked, as always, because she melted into her surroundings, could not remain separate. Objectivity a foreign land. She went from pool to pool with her pathetic light, losing her balance 6 times. If anyone had been watching, they would have seen a cursing, half-drunk, reckless biologist who had lost all perspective out in the middle of nowhere for the 2nd straight year, feeling vulnerable and lonely despite promising herself she never would, seeking something in the pools even though what she found by day was miraculous enough. She might have been shouting, whirling on those slippery rocks as if the best boots couldn't fail you, send you falling to crack your skull. But she found something miraculous. A glinting, wavery illumination came from one of the larger pools, and it gave her pause. She walked toward it, sobered enough to watch her steps, to shuffle along so she wouldn't crack her skull before seeing what it was. What she found was a rare species of colossal starfish, 6-armed, larger than a saucepan, bleeding a dark gold into the still water as if on fire. Professionals called it the destroyer of worlds. Thick spines covered it. Along the edges, fringed with emerald green, the most delicate, transparent cilia propelled it along its appointed route, searching for other, lesser starfish. She had never seen one before, even in an aquarium. The unexpected sight made her forget the slippery rock. She shifted her balance, almost fell, steadying herself with an arm against the pool's edge. But the longer she stared, the less comprehensible the creature became. It became alien, and she felt she knew nothing about nature, about ecosystems. Something about her mood and its dark glow eclipsed sense made this catalogued, studied, described creature irreducible to any of that. If she kept looking, she knew she would have to admit she knew less than nothing about herself as well. When she finally wrenched her gaze from the starfish and stood, she could not tell where sky met sea, whether she faced water or shore. She was completely adrift, dislocated, and all she had to navigate by was the glowing beacon below her. Turning that corner, encountering the crawler for the first time, was a similar experience at 1,000 times the magnitude, where on those rocks she could not tell sea from shore, here she could not tell stairs from ceiling. She steadied herself against the wall, but it seemed to cave in before her touch, and she struggled to keep from falling through. In the depths of the tower, she could not begin to understand what she was looking at. Even now she had to work hard to pull it together from fragments. It was difficult to tell what blanks her mind might be filling in just to remove the weight of so many unknowns. The golden light she had glimpsed vanished the moment she fully rounded the corner, replaced by a blue-green radiance unlike anything she had ever experienced. It surged toward her, blinding, bleeding, thick and layered and absorbing, overwhelming her ability to comprehend any shape within it. She forced herself to abandon sight, to focus on her other senses. The sound that came to her now was like a crescendo of shattering ice crystals, an unearthly noise that resolved into an intense melody and rhythm flooding her brain. From somewhere distant, she realized the words on the wall were infused with sound as well, though she had not had the capacity to hear it before. The vibration had texture and weight, accompanied by a burning smell like autumn leaves or an engine on the verge of overheating. The taste on her tongue was like brine set ablaze. She could not capture it in words or photographs. As she adjusted to the light, the crawler shifted at a lightning pace, as if mocking her ability to comprehend. It appeared as a figure within refracted glass panes, then as layered archways, then as a great slug-like monster ringed by stranger satellites, then as a glistening star. Her eyes kept glancing off it, as if her optic nerve were insufficient. Then it became an overwhelming hugeness in her battered vision, rising and rising as it seemed to leap toward her. The shape spread until it occupied spaces where it should not have been. A wall, a thick closed door blocking the stairs. Not a wall of light, but a wall of flesh that resembled light, with sharp curving elements and textures like frozen flowing water. Living things floated lazily around it like soft tadpoles at the limits of her vision, indistinguishable from the floating dark motes that are tricks of the eye. Within this fractured mass, half blind, but still triangulating through her other senses, she thought she saw a darker shadow, an arm or its echo, in constant blurring motion, laboriously imparting something to the left-hand wall. A code of change, recalibrations, transformations. Above it, another shadow, vaguely head-shaped, as indistinct as a shape seen through murky water and thick seaweed. She tried to pull back, to creep up the steps, but could not. Whether the crawler had trapped her or her brain had betrayed her, she was immobilized. The crawler changed, or she began blacking out repeatedly and coming back to consciousness. At times nothing appeared to be there, as if the words wrote themselves. Then the crawler would tremble into being and wink out again, leaving only the constant suggestion of an arm and the impression of words being written. What could she do when 5 senses were not enough? She still could not truly see it, and that terrified her most. In her mind, she stood over the starfish at Rock Bay, and the starfish grew until it was not just the tidal pool but the world, and she teetered on its rough, luminous surface as the light flowed through her. Against that awful pressure, as if the entire weight of Area X were concentrated here, she changed tactics. She tried to focus on the creation of the words themselves, the impression of a head or helmet above the arm, a cascade of sparks she knew were living organisms, a new word appearing on the wall. Still she could not see. The brightness coiled within her assumed a hushed quality, as if in a cathedral. The enormity of the experience, combined with the heartbeat and the crescendo of sound from the ceaseless writing, filled her until she had no room left. This moment, which she might have been waiting for her entire life unknowing, this encounter with the most beautiful and terrible thing she might ever experience, was beyond her. She had brought such inadequate recording equipment, given it such an inadequate name. The crawler. Time elongated, became nothing but fuel for the words this thing had created for who knew how many years, for who knew what purpose. She did not know how long she stood frozen at the threshold. She might have watched forever and never noticed the passage of years. But then came the question, what occurs after revelation and paralysis? Either death or a slow thawing, a return to the physical world. It was not that she became used to the crawler's presence, but that she reached a single infinitesimal moment when she recognized it as an organism. Complex, unique, intricate, awe-inspiring, dangerous. Inexplicable, beyond her senses and science, but still a living creature, one that practiced mimicry using her own thoughts. It might be pulling these impressions from her mind and projecting them back as camouflage to thwart the biologist in her. With an effort she could feel in the groan of her limbs, the dislocation in her bones, she managed to turn her back on the crawler. The simple, wrenching act brought such relief. She hugged the far wall, feeling its cool roughness, and closed her eyes. Why did she need vision when it only betrayed her? And began to crab walk back, still feeling the light on her back, the music from the words. The gun digging into her hip seemed pathetic and useless, as did the word sample. Both implied aiming at something, and what was there to aim at? She had only made it a step or two when she felt a rising heat and weight, a licking, lapping wetness, as if the thick light were transforming into the sea. She had thought she might escape, but it was not true. With one more step, as she began to choke, she realized the light had become a sea. Somehow, though not truly underwater, she was drowning. The panic that rose in her was the formless terror of a child who had fallen into a fountain and known, as her lungs filled with water, that she could die. There was no end to it. She was awash in a breathy green-blue ocean alight with sparks, drowning and struggling until some part of her realized she would drown forever. She imagined tumbling from rocks, battered by surf, washing up thousands of miles away in some other form, still retaining the awful memory. Then she felt the impression of hundreds of eyes turning in her direction. She was a thing in a swimming pool observed by a monstrous little girl, a mouse in an empty lot tracked by a fox, the prey the starfish had pulled down into the tidal pool. In some watertight compartment, the brightness told her she had to accept that she would not survive. She wanted to live, she really did, but she could not breathe any longer. She opened her mouth and welcomed the torrent. Except it was not really water, and the eyes were not eyes. She was pinned by the crawler, had let it in, and its full regard was upon her. She could not move, could not think, helpless and alone. A raging waterfall crashed down on her mind, but the water was comprised of fingers, 100 fingers, probing and pressing into the skin of her neck, then punching through the bone of her skull into her brain. The pressure eased, though the force did not relent. Still drowning, an icy calm came over her, and through it bled a monumental blue-green light. She smelled burning inside her own head, and there came a moment when she screamed, her skull crushed to dust and reassembled mote by mote. It was the most agony she had ever known. As if a metal rod had been repeatedly thrust into her, the pain distributed like a second skin inside her outline. Everything tinged red. She blacked out, came to, blacked out again, perpetually gasping, knees buckling, scrabbling at the wall. Her mouth opened so wide from shrieking that something popped in her jaw. She stopped breathing for a minute, but the brightness inside experienced no interruption. It kept oxygenating her blood. Then the invasiveness was gone, ripped away, and with it the drowning sensation and the sea. A push came, and the crawler tossed her aside, down the steps beyond it. She washed up bruised and crumpled, falling like a sack, crumbling before something never meant to be, never meant to invade her. She sucked in air in great shuddering gasps. But she could not stay within the range of its regard. Throat raw, insides eviscerated, she flung herself down into the greater dark below, on hands and knees at first, scrabbling to escape, driven by blind panic to get out of its sight. Only when the light behind her faded, only when she felt safe, did she drop to the floor and lie there for a long time. She was recognizable to the crawler now, words it could understand, unlike the anthropologist. She wondered if her cells would long hide their transformation, if this was the beginning of the end, but mostly she felt the utter relief of having passed a gauntlet, if barely. The brightness deep within her was curled up, traumatized. Perhaps her only real expertise, her only talent, was to endure beyond the endurable. She did not know when she managed to stand again, legs rubbery, or how long it took, but eventually she got up. Soon the spiral stairs straightened out. The stifling humidity lessened, the tiny wall creatures vanished, and the crawler's sounds became muffled. She still saw the ghosts of past scrawlings, even her own luminescence muted here. She was wary of that tracery of words, as if they could hurt her as surely as the crawler, yet there was comfort in following them. The variations were more legible now, making more sense. And it came for me, and it cast out all else. Retraced again and again. Were the words more naked down here, or did she just possess more knowledge? She noticed that these new steps shared the depth and width of the lighthouse steps almost exactly. Above her, the ceiling had changed, now covered with a profusion of deep, curving grooves. She stopped to drink water, to catch her breath. The aftershock of the encounter still washed over her in waves. When she continued, it was with a numbed awareness that more revelations might await, that she had to prepare herself. A few minutes later, a tiny rectangular block of fuzzy white light began to take shape far below. As she descended, it grew larger with a reluctance she could only call hesitation. After another half-hour, she thought it must be a door, but the haziness remained as if obscuring itself. The closer she got, the more certain she became that it bore an uncanny resemblance to the door she had glimpsed when glancing back after crossing the border. The specific kind of vagueness triggered the recognition. In the next half-hour, an instinctual urge to turn back arose, which she overrode by telling herself she could not yet face the return journey and the crawler again. But the grooves in the ceiling hurt to look at, as if they ran across her own skull, continually remade. They had become lines of repelling force. An hour later, as the shimmering white rectangle grew larger but no more distinct, she was filled with such wrongness that she suffered nausea. The idea of a trap grew in her mind, that this floating light was not a door but the maw of some beast, and if she entered, it would devour her. Finally she halted. The words continued unrelenting downward. She estimated the door lay another 500 or 600 steps below. It blazed in her vision. She felt a rawness on her skin as if sunburned from looking at it. She wanted to continue but could not. She could not will her legs, could not force her mind to overcome the fear and unease. Even the temporary absence of the brightness, as if hiding, counseled against further progress. She remained there on the steps, watching the door for a long time. The thought nagged at her that this paralysis might be residual hypnotic compulsion, that even from beyond death, the psychologist had found a way to manipulate her. Perhaps some encoded directive her infection could not override. Was she in the end stages of a prolonged annihilation? The reason did not matter. She knew she would never reach the door. She would become too sick to move, would never make it back to the surface, eyes cut by the grooves in the ceiling. She would be stuck on the steps like the anthropologist, almost as much a failure at recognizing the impossible. So she turned around in great pain, feeling as if she had left part of herself there, and began to trudge back up. The image of that hazy door of light loomed as large in her imagination as the crawler's immensity. She remembered the sensation, in that moment of turning away, that something was now peering out at her from the door below. But when she glanced over her shoulder, only the familiar hazy white brilliance greeted her. She wished the rest of the journey could have been a blur, as if she were the flame the psychologist had seen, staring out through her own burning. She wished what came next was sunlight and the surface. But though she had earned the right for it to be over, it was not over. She remembered every painful, terrifying step back up. She remembered halting before the corner where the crawler still labored at its incomprehensible task, unsure if she could endure the excavation of her mind once more, unsure if she would go mad from the drowning sensation again, no matter how reason told her it was illusion. But she also knew that the weaker she became, the more her mind would betray her. Soon she would retreat into the shadows, become a shell haunting the lower steps. She might never have more strength or resolve than in that moment. She let go of Rock Bay, of the starfish. She thought instead of her husband's journal, of her husband in a boat somewhere to the north. She thought of how everything lay above, and nothing now below. So she hugged the wall again. She closed her eyes again. She endured the light again, flinching and moaning, expecting the rush of sea into her mouth and her head cracked open. But none of that happened. She did not know why, except that having scanned and sampled her, and having released her once based on unknown criteria, the crawler no longer displayed any interest. She was almost out of sight above it, rounding the corner, when some stubborn part of her insisted on a single glance back. One last defiant look at something she might never understand. Staring back at her amid that profusion of selves generated by the crawler, she saw, barely visible, the face of a man, hooded in shadow and orbited by indescribable things she could only think of as his jailers. His expression displayed such a complex extremity of emotion that she was transfixed. She saw the endurance of unending pain and sorrow, but shining through as well a grim satisfaction and ecstasy. She had never seen such an expression, but she recognized that face. She had seen it in a photograph. A sharp eagle's eye gleaming from a heavy face, the left eye lost to his squint, a thick beard hiding all but a hint of a firm chin. Trapped within the crawler, the last lighthouse keeper stared out at her. She felt, not just across a vast, unbridgeable gulf, but also across the years. Though thinner, eyes receded, jawline more pronounced, he had not aged a day since that photograph was taken more than 30 years ago. This man who now existed in a place none of them could comprehend. Did he know what he had become? Or had he gone mad long ago? Could he even really see her? She did not know how long he had been looking at her before she turned, or if he had even existed before she saw him. But he was real to her, even though she held his gaze for too short a time, and she could not say anything passed between them. How long would have been enough? There was nothing she could do for him, and she had no room left for anything but her own survival. There might be far worse things than drowning. She could not tell what he had lost or gained over the past 30 years, but she envied his journey not at all. She had never dreamed before Area X, or at least never remembered her dreams. Her husband found this strange and once suggested she might live in a continuous dream from which she had never woken. Perhaps he meant it as a joke, perhaps not. He had, after all, been haunted by a nightmare for years, shaped by it, until it fell away as a facade, a house and a basement and awful crimes. But she had had an exhausting day at work and took it seriously, especially in the last week before he left. She told him they all lived in a continuous dream, and waking came only when something disturbed the edges of what they took as reality. He asked if he was a pinprick disturbing her reality, and she caught the desperation in his mood. She deflected with a dry remark about baiting the ghost bird, though she felt sick to her stomach. It seemed important to be normal for him. Later, when she saw what normal could be, she wished she had been abnormal, had shouted, had done anything but be banal. He wondered if he was a figment of her reality, existing only to do her bidding. She replied that he was failing spectacularly. He countered that he was succeeding spectacularly because she wanted him to fail, but he was smiling. He came up behind her to hug her. He had thick forearms, a wide chest, ridiculously strong hands that should live in a cave, assets when he sailed. The antiseptic rubber smell of Band-Aids clung to him like unctuous cologne. He was one big Band-Aid placed directly on the wound. He asked where she would be if they were not together. She had no answer. Not here, not there, maybe nowhere. Then he said he was afraid, and he had a selfish thing to ask, something he had no right to ask. She told him to ask it anyway. She was still angry, but in those last days she had become reconciled to her loss, compartmentalized so she would not withhold affection. Part of her raged against the systematic loss of her field assignments, envied his opportunity, gloated about the empty lot because it was hers alone. He asked if she would come after him if he did not come back, if she could. She told him he was coming back, to sit right there like a golem, with all the things she knew about him drained out. How she wished she had answered him even to say no, and how she wished now, though it was always impossible, that she had gone to Area X for him. A swimming pool, a rocky bay, an empty lot, a tower, a lighthouse. These things were real and not real. They existed and did not exist. She remade them in her mind with every thought, every remembered detail, each time slightly different. Sometimes they were camouflage, disguises, sometimes something more truthful. When she finally reached the surface, she lay on her back atop the tower, too exhausted to move, smiling at the simple, unexpected pleasure of the morning sun's heat on her eyelids. She was continually reimagining the world, the lighthouse keeper colonizing her thoughts. She pulled the photograph from her pocket, staring at his face, as if he held some further answer she could not grasp. She needed to know she had truly seen him, not an apparition conjured by the crawler. What convinced her most was not the photograph, but the sample the anthropologist had taken from the crawler's edge, the sample that had proven to be human brain tissue. With that anchor, she began to form a narrative as best she could, even as she stood and made her way back to base camp. It was difficult. She knew nothing of the lighthouse keeper's life, had no indicators to imagine him. Just the photograph and that terrible glimpse. All she could think was that he had had a normal life once, but none of its rituals had any permanence or helped him. He had been caught in a storm that had not abated. Perhaps he had even seen it coming from the top of the lighthouse, the event arriving like a wave. What had manifested? She thought of it as a thorn, a long, thick thorn buried deep in the side of the world, injecting itself. Emanating from it was an endless, perhaps automatic, need to assimilate and mimic. The catalyst was a script of words, powering the engine of transformation. Perhaps it was a creature in perfect symbiosis with a host of others. Perhaps merely a machine. But in either case, if it had intelligence, it was far different from their own. It created a new world out of their ecosystem, its processes and aims utterly alien, working through supreme acts of mirroring, remaining hidden, never surrendering the foundations of its otherness, even as it became what it encountered. She did not know how this thorn arrived or how far it came. But imagine the expeditions, 12 or 50 or 100, continually encountering that entity, becoming fodder and remade. They came at a hidden entry point along a mysterious border, mirrored in the tower's depths. Imagine that they all still existed in Area X in some form, especially those who came back, layered over one another, communicating in whatever way left to them. This communication sometimes lent an uncanny quality to the landscape because of the narcissism of the human gaze. But it was just part of the natural world. She might never know what triggered the doppelgangers, but it might not matter. Imagine, too, that while the tower made and remade the world inside the border, it also slowly sent emissaries across, in ever greater numbers, into tangled gardens and fallow fields. How did it travel, and how far? What strange matter mixed and mingled? In some future moment, the infiltration might reach even that remote sheet of coastal rock, quietly germinate in the tidal pool she knew so well. Unless she was wrong that Area X was rousing from slumber, changing, becoming different than before. The terrible thought she could not dislodge after all she had seen was that she could no longer say with conviction this was a bad thing. Not when she looked at the pristine nature of Area X and then at the world beyond, which they had altered so much. Before she died, the psychologist had said she had changed, and she thought the psychologist meant she had changed sides. It was not true. She did not even know if there were sides or what that might mean, but it could be true. She saw now that she could be persuaded. A religious or superstitious person might see it differently. Almost anyone else might see it differently. But she was not those people. She was just the biologist. She did not require any of this to have a deeper meaning. She was aware that all of this speculation was incomplete, inexact, inaccurate, useless. If she did not have real answers, it was because they still did not know what questions to ask. Their instruments were useless, their methodology broken, their motivations selfish. There was nothing much left to tell, though she had not quite told it right, but she was done trying anyway. After leaving the tower, she had returned to base camp briefly, and then come here, to the top of the lighthouse. She had spent 4 long days perfecting this account, for all its faults, and it was supplemented by a second journal recording all her findings from the various samples taken by herself and other expedition members. She had even written a note for her parents. She had bound these materials together with her husband's journal and would leave them here, atop the pile beneath the trapdoor. The table and rug had been moved so that anyone could find what once was hidden. She had replaced the lighthouse keeper's photograph in its frame and put it back on the wall of the landing. She had added a second circle around his face because she could not help herself. If the hints in the journals were accurate, when the crawler reached the end of its latest cycle within the tower, Area X would enter a convulsive season of barricades and blood, a cataclysmic molting, perhaps sparked by activated spores erupting from the words. The past 2 nights, she had seen a growing cone of energy rising above the tower and spilling into the surrounding wilderness. Though nothing had yet come out of the sea, from the ruined village figures had emerged and headed for the tower. From base camp, no sign of life. From the beach below, not even a boot remained of the psychologist, as if she had melted into the sand. Every night, the moaning creature let her know it retained dominion over its kingdom of reeds. Observing all of this had quelled the last ashes of the burning compulsion to know everything, anything. In its place remained the knowledge that the brightness was not done with her. It was just beginning, and the thought of continually harming herself to remain human seemed pathetic. She would not be here when the 13th expedition reached base camp. Would they see her yet, or were they about to? Would she melt into this landscape, or look up from a stand of reeds, or the waters of the canal to see some other explorer staring down in disbelief? Would she be aware that anything was wrong, or out of place? She planned to continue into Area X, to go as far as she could before it was too late. She would follow her husband up the coast, past the island even. She did not believe she would find him. She did not need to find him, but she wanted to see what he saw. She wanted to feel him close, as if he were in the room. And if she was honest, she could not shake the sense that he was still here somewhere, even if utterly transformed, in the eye of a dolphin, in the touch of an uprising of moss, anywhere and everywhere. Perhaps she would even find a boat abandoned on a deserted beach, if she were lucky, and some sign of what happened next. She could be content with just that, even knowing what she knew. This part she would do alone, leaving everyone behind. Do not follow. She was well beyond them now and traveling very fast. Had there always been someone like her to bury the bodies? To have regrets? To carry on after everyone else was dead? She was the last casualty of both the 11th and the 12th expeditions. She was not returning home. The end. And now the border closes behind us for a while. Thank you for staying here, for walking through the strange silence of Area X, for letting mystery linger instead of demanding answers from it. Stories like Annihilation leave something behind in us, and maybe that's why they stay with us long after the final page or final scene fades into darkness. Jeff VanderMeer once found the first seeds of this world while walking through Florida's St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge, surrounded by wetlands, shifting ecosystems, and the uneasy beauty of places where nature seems older than memory itself. The Deepwater Horizon disaster also haunted the edges of his thinking. The idea of a wounded world trying to heal itself in ways humanity might never understand. He has spoken about images arriving almost like dreams. A tunnel descending into the earth, living words on walls, fragments that refused to leave him alone until they became stories. And perhaps that's what makes Annihilation feel so unsettling. Beneath the science fiction and the impossible landscapes, it isn't only asking what happens when we confront the unknown. It quietly asks what happens when we confront ourselves. Transformation in this story is never clean. Sometimes change arrives like wonder. Sometimes, like grief. Sometimes it arrives wearing the face of beauty. VanderMeer continued exploring strange and living worlds in works like Authority, Acceptance, Born, and later journeys through the Southern Reach universe. Across his stories, there is always something breathing beneath the surface, a fascination with ecology, identity, and humanity's uneasy relationship with the world around it. Then the story stepped onto the screen in 2018, and filmmaker Alex Garland chose not to build a frame-by-frame translation. Garland, who also brought us Ex Machina, Men, and Civil War, described his version as a memory of the book, as if someone had woken from a dream and tried to recreate the feeling before it vanished. That decision changed almost everything. Jeff VanderMeer's unnamed expedition members became characters like Lena, played by Natalie Portman. The hypnotic manipulations central to the novel faded away. The mysterious border transformed into the shimmering wall audiences would come to know as the Shimmer. The film moved away from the novel's quiet internal dread and leaned toward grief, self-destruction, and emotional collapse. Yet somehow both stories still seemed to stare into the same darkness from different angles. And behind the camera, there were countless people shaping that dream. Rob Hardy's cinematography gave the world an unreal softness that felt almost alive. Musicians Ben Salisbury and Jeff Barrow created sounds that seemed less like music and more like signals arriving from somewhere unknown. Producers Scott Rudin, Andrew MacDonald, Eli Bush, and Alan Reich helped bring an unusually risky science fiction film into existence. One of the most unforgettable creations, that distorted bear carrying fragments of a human scream, became one of the film's most haunting ideas because it felt like nature itself had forgotten where imitation should stop. And Natalie Portman, Jennifer Jason Leigh, Gina Rodriguez, Tessa Thompson, and Oscar Isaac carried the emotional weight of people quietly falling apart while pretending they weren't. Strangely, despite the film earning passionate admiration over time, many viewers first walked away uncertain about what they had seen. Others returned years later and discovered something different waiting for them. Maybe that feels fitting for Annihilation. Area X was never a place meant to be solved. It was a place meant to be experienced. If this journey stirred something in you, I hope you'll someday sit with the original novel itself. There are corners of Jeff VanderMeer's world that no retelling, no film, and no voice can completely recreate. And if you found something meaningful here, you're invited to stay close for future journeys. Share your thoughts, your interpretations, even your disagreements, because stories become larger when different minds carry them forward. Subscribe if you'd like more worlds to step into, and pass this story along to someone who loves strange places and impossible questions. For now, the expedition is over. But somewhere in the distance, beyond the last familiar shoreline, something is still growing, and some stories never really end. They simply wait for us to return.